I was 28 when I decided to spend 2 weeks alone in a rented cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. It was late October of 2006, the kind of time when the air always smells faintly like wood smoke and the leaves are past their brightest but still cling stubbornly to the branches. I'd been working long hours in Boise for the past year, the kind of work that leaves you exhausted but somehow not satisfied, and I needed a break. Time without phones buzzing or coworkers leaning over my shoulder. The listing for the cabin wasn't fancy, just a few pictures on a website that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. It was about 30 miles outside a small town called Elkford, up in the timberline where the pines grow thick and the road turns from cracked asphalt to gravel, and eventually to dirt. The owner was some older guy named Cal, who told me over email that there'd be no cell service and that I'd have to bring my own firewood unless I wanted to pay extra for his to be delivered. That was fine by me. I left Boise before sunrise. The drive north took me through long stretches of empty highway, the kind where you can go 20 minutes without seeing another car. I stopped in Elkford for groceries, basic stuff like pasta, canned chili, oatmeal, and coffee. I also bought a couple of six-packs, even though I wasn't planning on drinking much. At the general store, I picked up 2 more bundles of firewood, because I'd rather have too much than too little. The last hour of the drive was nothing but winding dirt roads, barely wide enough for my old Tacoma. The forest on either side was dense and dark, the trees so close to the road they felt like walls. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised by how remote it felt. I knew it would be quiet, but this was the kind of quiet where you could almost hear the blood in your ears. The cabin itself was simple: dark brown siding, a small porch with 2 rocking chairs, and a woodpile stacked neatly against the side. The windows were old, the kind with glass that's just slightly wavy when the light hits it. Inside, there was a living room with a wood stove, a couch that had seen better days, and a small kitchen with mismatched cabinets. There was one bedroom with a full-size bed, and a bathroom with a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. That first day, I unpacked slowly, taking my time stacking the firewood near the stove and checking through the cabinets. There was a faint smell of mildew, probably from the damp mountain air. I opened a few windows to let the place breathe. By late afternoon, the temperature was already dropping, so I lit my first fire in the stove. The dry wood caught easily, and soon the cabin was filled with that deep, crackling warmth that makes you want to curl up and do nothing. I spent that evening on the porch, drinking a beer and watching the light fade. The forest was almost unnervingly still. No distant car engines, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind in the treetops. As the darkness settled in, I started to notice how complete it was. Back in Boise, even on the quietest nights, there's always some faint glow on the horizon. Out here, when the sun dipped below the ridges, the dark swallowed everything. I slept fine that first night, though I woke once around 3 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, more like a faint crunch of leaves or snow. I stayed in bed, listening. It didn't last long, maybe 15 seconds, then silence again. Probably just a deer. The next few days settled into a routine. I'd get up early, make coffee, then take short hikes on the trails behind the cabin. I brought a small backpack with water, snacks, and a compass, though I stuck to the main paths. The air was crisp, and the higher I climbed, the more I could see the rolling ridges fading into the distance. By late afternoon, I'd be back at the cabin, starting the stove and cooking something simple. But there were little things that didn't feel right. On the 4th morning, I woke to find the woodpile shorter than I remembered. I told myself I just misjudged it when I unloaded the bundles, but it nagged at me. That night, I set a couple of logs aside inside the cabin so I wouldn't have to go out in the cold. The next morning, one of the logs outside was lying a few feet away from the pile, half buried in the frost. Then there was the trail incident. I'd hiked about a mile up one of the switchbacks when I noticed fresh boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different, wider, heavier. They headed up the trail, then veered off into the brush. I stood there for a minute scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the forest has a way of swallowing movement. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. Around midnight, I heard the crunching again. Slow, deliberate steps somewhere beyond the porch. I got up quietly and turned off the oil lamp, letting my eyes adjust. The sound stopped. I stood there in the dark for a long time, my hand on the stove poker, but nothing else happened. By the end of the first week, the unease was starting to dig under my skin. I double-checked the locks each night. I kept my folding knife in my pocket, even inside the cabin. The boot prints appeared twice more, both times leading off the trail and vanishing into the dense trees. I told myself it was probably a hunter or another hiker, but something about the randomness of the prints didn't sit right. They never came from the town side of the trail, always deeper into the forest. The real breaking point came on the 10th night. I'd just gone to bed when I heard the sound again, but this time closer, right outside the porch. The steps were slow, deliberate. I lay there holding my breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would give me away. Then, clear as day, I heard the creak of the porch boards. Whoever it was had stepped onto it. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing on the porch. I stepped out slowly, sweeping the light over the clearing. The trees loomed like black pillars. My breath came out in sharp clouds. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the tree line, a shape too tall and still to be an animal. The light caught on something pale. Maybe a face, maybe just the reflection of bark. But before I could focus, it turned and slipped back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going, sat with my back against the wall, and listened to every creak and groan of the cabin. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave early. When I stepped outside to load the truck, there was something on the porch. At first, I thought it was a bundle of sticks, but when I bent closer, I saw it was the log I'd left inside the cabin 3 nights earlier, the one I'd brought in to avoid going outside. It was lying neatly across the boards, frost clinging to its surface. I drove out of there without looking back, my eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The forest stayed with me the whole way down the mountain, crowding the road until I hit the town and the world felt open again. I never reported it to the police. What would I have said? That someone had been moving my firewood and leaving footprints? But deep down, I knew it wasn't just random. Someone had been watching the cabin, watching me. And the worst part was knowing they'd been close enough to step onto the porch without me hearing until it was too late. I've never gone back to Elkford. I've never stayed in a cabin that far from other people again. But even now, sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think about that log on the porch, cold and heavy with frost. And I wonder how many nights they were standing out there in the dark, just watching. I still remember the first time I saw the place. It was late September of 1998. Right after the leaves had started turning that copper-red color you only get in the colder parts of the north. I had just turned 29, burned out from city life, and the idea of being alone in the woods for a few weeks felt like the only way to quiet the static in my head. I found the listing in the back of a local paper from a small town in Minnesota. Cabin on Coldwater Lake, $175 per week, fully stocked, private access road. The price was low enough to make me suspicious, but the pictures looked clean and the lake was about an hour from Duluth, far enough from any real tourist traffic. The drive up took most of the afternoon. I had loaded my old Ford Bronco with everything I thought I'd need: sleeping bag, fishing gear, canned food, an axe, and a second-hand kerosene heater just in case the place didn't have good insulation. The back of the truck smelled faintly of motor oil and wet leaves from where I'd tracked in dirt. The access road wasn't really a road at all. It was a narrow strip of packed dirt and loose gravel that snaked off Highway 61, winding through miles of thick pine forest. The canopy closed in overhead, turning the light a dim greenish color. Every so often, I'd see a squirrel dart across in front of me, its tail twitching like a live wire. It took 15 minutes to reach the cabin from the turnoff, and in that time I didn't see a single other house. The forest here was denser than anything I'd seen before. Tall, black spruce that seemed to crowd in on the edges of the road, their trunks leaning like they were eavesdropping. The cabin itself sat about 40 yards from the lake's edge, a squat, rectangular building with weathered brown siding and a tin roof that looked like it had been hammered together by hand. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the wooden steps creaked under my boots when I carried my duffel inside. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and something else. Old, stale air, like the place hadn't been opened in a while. The main room had a small couch, a wood stove, and a square table with 2 chairs. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling. There was no TV, no radio. The kitchen had an ancient gas range, a chipped enamel sink, and shelves lined with mismatched mugs. In the back was a small bedroom with a double bed and a thin mattress that looked like it had been sat on more than slept on. The lake was the best part. Coldwater Lake stretched out like a sheet of hammered steel, the surface smooth except for the occasional ripple of wind. Across the water, the opposite shore rose into a ridge of trees so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. The air was so still I could hear my own breathing. The first 2 days were perfect. I woke with the sun, made coffee on the stove, and sat on the porch with a blanket over my legs while the lake steamed in the cold morning air. I fished in the afternoons, pulling up a few smallmouth bass and 1 fat walleye. At night, I built a fire in the wood stove and read by lantern light until my eyes burned. It was the 3rd night when things started to feel off. That day had been colder. The sky stayed overcast, and a steady wind pushed down from the north, carrying the smell of rain. I'd been out on the lake in the old aluminum rowboat tied to the dock, but the wind made it nearly impossible to keep my line where I wanted it. I gave up around 3 and headed back, chilled to the bone despite my jacket. By dusk, the wind had died. The forest was completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. I remember thinking how strange it was not to hear even the faint hum of insects. Around 9, as I was sitting on the couch with my book, I heard it. A single, sharp crack from somewhere outside. Not the pop of cooling wood or the shuffle of an animal, but the clean, dry snap of a stick under weight. I froze. The nearest neighbors were miles away. I knew that because the owner, a man named Bill Haskins, had told me when I picked up the keys. "Nobody's out there but you," he'd said. "If you see someone, it's because they want to be seen." I got up slowly, killed the lamp, and stood by the window. The moon was bright enough to cast silver light over the clearing in front of the cabin. I didn't see anyone, but the woods on the left side, the side where the access road came in, looked different, like there was a shadow in there that didn't belong. Too tall, too still. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks in the low light. Still, I stayed awake until well past midnight, sitting in the dark and listening. I didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I found something strange by the edge of the porch. Footprints. They were faint, pressed into the soft earth where the rain had fallen 2 nights before. Not boots, not bare feet either. Sneakers, maybe, but the size maybe a men's 12 or 13. Bigger than mine. They led from the treeline toward the porch, then stopped at the bottom step. No prints going back. I told myself they were old, maybe from the last person who rented the place. But when I checked, I noticed the edges of the prints were still sharp. No leaves had fallen into them yet. I spent the rest of the day on edge, glancing at the trees every few minutes. The wind had picked up again, making the branches sway and creak, and each time it did, I felt a tight knot in my stomach. That night, I locked the door for the first time. The real trouble started on the 5th night. It was late past 11. I'd gone to bed early but couldn't sleep. My head was full of thoughts I couldn't shake. Every creak of the cabin felt louder than it should have. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate sound coming from the side of the cabin. Footsteps. 1. Pause. Another. Pause. They were moving along the wall, toward the back where the bedroom window was. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped just under the window. Then silence. For almost a full minute, nothing happened. Then I heard a faint, rhythmic sound. Breathing. Someone was standing outside my window, breathing slow and steady. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but it was on the table in the main room. If I moved, whoever was out there would hear. After maybe 30 seconds, the breathing stopped. The footsteps started again, moving toward the trees. Then nothing. In the morning, I walked the perimeter. I found more prints. Fresh ones this time, still damp with dew. They went from the treeline to the bedroom window, then back into the woods. I didn't fish that day. I didn't even leave the cabin. By late afternoon, I'd made up my mind. I'd leave the next morning. I didn't care about the remaining rent. I'd drive back to Duluth, maybe stay at a motel for a night before heading home. But that night, it didn't wait until midnight. It started just after sunset. A thump against the back wall. Not a knock, not an accident. A hard, deliberate hit. Then another. Then footsteps circling the cabin, slow and heavy. I grabbed the axe from the woodpile and stood in the middle of the main room, every light on. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might drown out the sound of the steps. They stopped at the porch. I heard the wood groan under the weight. Then the doorknob rattled. I don't know how long I stood there, axe in hand, staring at the door. Could have been 10 seconds, could have been a minute. Eventually, the rattling stopped. Silence again. Then footsteps retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair with the axe across my knees, eyes locked on the door until the first light of dawn. When the sun came up, I loaded the Bronco in under 5 minutes. I didn't check the back of the cabin. I didn't look for footprints. I just got in and drove. When I reached the highway, I realized I hadn't seen another car the entire time I was there, and I never went back. It was late October of 2015 when I decided to take a few days for myself in the mountains. I had been working long shifts at the factory all year, and my head felt foggy from the constant noise of machines and the same four walls. I found an old cabin listed on a rental site. The ad said it was quiet, remote, perfect for hunters or writers, but it didn't mention the lack of cell service. The photos looked promising. Wood walls, a small fireplace, a porch that overlooked a stretch of pine forest that seemed endless. I booked 3 nights without thinking twice. I left work on a Thursday afternoon, packed the basics: some canned food, a camp stove just in case, my sleeping bag, and a heavy flashlight. The drive was longer than I expected. Once I left the highway, the road narrowed into 2 winding lanes that climbed steadily into the hills. The sun dipped low fast, and the temperature followed. It was just after 6 when I passed the last gas station in a tiny town with 1 blinking streetlight. I topped off the tank, bought a jug of water, and a pack of batteries I figured I wouldn't need. The last hour of the drive was through thick forest. My headlights picked up trunks of trees that stood like black pillars, disappearing into the dark canopy above. There were no streetlights, no other cars. My GPS lost signal somewhere along that stretch, so I had to rely on printed directions I'd saved just in case. The final turn was onto a dirt road, narrower than my truck by much, with brush scraping the sides. The tires crunched over gravel and scattered branches. It felt longer than the 3 miles the directions had promised. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly like the pictures, but somehow lonelier. A squat rectangle of dark wood with a tin roof that glinted faintly in my headlights. No other structures around, just trees on all sides. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the boards silvered from years of weather. I parked beside it, shut off the engine, and the silence hit me. No hum of cars in the distance, no voices, just the faint creak of the trees shifting in the wind. Inside smelled faintly of old wood smoke and dust. The air was cooler than outside, and I had to flick on my flashlight to find the main light switch. 1 dim bulb lit the single room, bed in the far corner, small wood table with 2 chairs, a counter with an old propane stove and a few shelves. In the back, there was a narrow door to a bathroom with a rusted metal sink and a toilet that flushed slow. The cabin was exactly what I expected, but with one detail the pictures hadn't caught. The windows didn't have locks. I unpacked, made a quick dinner of canned chili on the propane stove, and ate while sitting at the table listening to the forest. The wind moved through the trees in waves, like the sound of distant traffic, but underneath there was an occasional sharper noise, a crack of a branch, something scuffing over leaves. I told myself it was just deer. When it got late, I lit the small wood stove for heat. Took a while for the logs to catch, but eventually the warmth spread. I crawled into my sleeping bag on the bed and lay there listening to the soft tick of the cooling stove. The night outside was deep and heavy. The window over the bed had no curtain, just the black glass reflecting my face. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. No reason at first, just that sudden awareness you get when your body knows something changed. The cabin was silent, but then I heard it. The faint crunch of gravel, not the road closer. My first thought was that an animal had wandered near the truck, but the sound was slow, uneven, like footsteps. I stayed still, telling myself it could be the wind moving something. After a minute, it stopped. I lay awake for a long time, heart thudding, until I drifted off again. The next morning was cold and pale. I made coffee on the stove and stepped outside. The air smelled sharp and damp, and mist hung low between the trees. That's when I saw it, just at the edge of the clearing in the grass near the treeline. A shoe print. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier, and this was fresh. I checked my own boots against it. Too big. I told myself maybe the owner had been here recently, maybe checking on the place before I arrived. But it still sat in my head all morning. I went for a short hike along the dirt road, just to shake the unease. The forest was quiet except for the occasional crack of branches high above. The trees were tall and close, letting in little light. I found no houses, no cabins, nothing but more woods. When I got back in the afternoon, the print was gone. The damp ground had been scuffed over, like someone had brushed it with a branch. That stuck with me more than finding it in the first place. That night, I made sure my flashlight was on the table next to the bed. I pushed the table up against the door, even though it had a working deadbolt. I felt stupid doing it, but it made me feel better. I kept the wood stove burning low for light. Sleep came in shallow bursts. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I woke again, this time to a different sound. Not outside, inside. It was faint, but clear enough to cut through the haze of sleep. A soft, slow creak of the floorboards, just one, then silence. The cabin wasn't big. Any step inside would carry. I didn't move. My breathing sounded too loud. I gripped the flashlight but didn't turn it on, afraid of what I might see. After what felt like an hour but was probably a few minutes, I heard nothing else. I stayed awake until the first light seeped in. In daylight, I searched every inch of the cabin. The windows were still unlocked but closed. The door was still deadbolt with the table against it. I checked under the bed, the cabinets, even the bathroom. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there. By the third day, the tension sat heavy in my chest. I wanted to leave early, but part of me felt ridiculous. It was just a cabin in the woods, and I'd paid for the full stay. I decided I'd leave at first light the next morning. I spent the day packing most of my things into the truck so I could get on the road fast. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep much. I sat at the table with my flashlight and my keys in my pocket. The wind picked up, rattling the loose tin on the roof. Around midnight, through the window by the table, I caught movement. A shape low, fast between the trees. My chest tightened. I killed the lantern, letting the darkness settle. My eyes adjusted slowly. The shape moved again, closer this time, and I realized it was a man. He wasn't coming straight toward the cabin but circling, staying near the treeline. He stopped often, just standing still. I didn't move for a long time, just watching. Eventually, he stepped forward into the clearing. His clothes were dark, his head bare despite the cold. He walked toward the cabin until he was maybe 20 feet away, then stopped again. We stayed like that, staring through the dark. Me inside, him outside. I couldn't see his face well, just the pale blur of skin. He turned his head slowly, scanning the cabin, then walked toward the back where I couldn't see. I waited 30 seconds, then grabbed my bag, shoved it in the truck, and started the engine. The sound exploded in the quiet night, and I saw him again in the rearview mirror, standing at the corner of the cabin, watching. I didn't stop to think. I threw the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, the headlights catching glimpses of him in the trees for far longer than I wanted. It took nearly an hour to reach the highway. I didn't see another car the whole way. When I hit the first town, I pulled into the gas station and sat there for a while, shaking, before heading home. I never reported it. I couldn't explain it without sounding unsure of my own memory. Maybe he'd been some hunter, maybe he'd been lost. But the print, the sound inside, the way he moved around the cabin without ever knocking or calling out, that wasn't someone just passing through. I've never gone back to a cabin since. Even now, years later, when I wake in the night to a floorboard creak in my own apartment, part of me is right back there, staring into the dark, waiting for him to step closer. I was 36 when it happened. It was late October, 2012, and the air in northern Minnesota had already turned sharp, the kind that burns your nose a little when you breathe too deep. I had been living in Duluth for a couple of years by then, working in a machine shop that repaired old farm equipment. I was tired, mentally more than physically, the kind of tired you can't sleep off in a weekend. A friend from work had told me about an old hunting cabin his uncle kept up near the Canadian border. It wasn't fancy, he'd warned me about that, but it was empty for the season, and if I wanted some quiet, I could use it. The cabin sat about a mile back from a dirt road, no power, no running water, just 4 walls, a tin roof, a wood stove, and a pump well out front. That sounded fine to me. In fact, it sounded perfect. I left early on a Friday morning, a duffel bag in the passenger seat and a 5-gallon gas can in the back, along with enough canned food, bread, and jerky to last me 3 or 4 days. The weather was gray but dry. By the time I reached the turnoff, the paved highway had shrunk to a narrow strip of cracked asphalt, and then to loose gravel, and finally to a dirt track lined with tall pines and birch. The road was soft in places, and I could feel my tires sink a little as I rolled along. When I found the clearing, the cabin was exactly as I'd pictured it. Squat and low, made of weathered logs gone gray over the years. The roof was patchy tin, dull with rust. A small porch leaned a little to one side, and a pile of split wood sat under an old blue tarp. There were no other buildings in sight, just trees, a thin layer of frost still clinging to the grass in the shadowed spots. Inside smelled like dust and old pine sap. The floor was bare wood, the kind with deep gaps between the boards. A table and 2 mismatched chairs sat in one corner. The wood stove squatted in the center of the far wall, a blackened stovepipe disappearing through the ceiling. There was a cot against the wall, covered with a folded wool blanket that looked clean enough. A few shelves held a lantern, some candles, a tin of matches, and a couple of chipped mugs. I unpacked slowly, stacking my food on the table and hanging my jacket on a bent nail by the door. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your ears. It felt strange, but also good, like a weight sliding off my shoulders. The first day passed quietly. I gathered some more wood from the pile, checked the pump, cold, iron-tasting water splashed into the bucket, and took a short walk through the trees until the light started to fade. Dinner was a can of stew warmed on the stove. I read a bit by lantern light, then crawled into the cot. The blanket was scratchy but warm. I woke up once in the night to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't close, more like something shifting through the underbrush 50 yards off. Probably a deer. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next day was colder. The sky stayed heavy and low, and a thin wind whispered through the trees. I spent the morning chopping wood and carrying it inside, stacking it neatly by the stove. In the afternoon, I walked a little farther into the woods. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen needles, moss, and occasional patches of thin ice. Every so often, I'd see an old rusted tin can or a scrap of metal half buried in the dirt, like someone had camped there decades ago. It was on my way back that I saw something odd. About 50 feet off the trail, there was a small mound of earth that didn't look natural. The dirt was looser than the surrounding ground, like it had been dug up and packed down again. A few broken sticks lay across it, and the grass around it was bent flat. I stood there for a minute, then shrugged it off. Probably an old animal burrow or someone had buried trash there years ago. That night, the noises were closer. I woke up around 2 in the morning to the sound of crunching leaves, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My first thought was a bear, but it was late in the season for that, and the steps didn't sound heavy enough. I stayed still, breathing shallow, my ears straining. The footsteps paused for a long time, then started again, moving away toward the trees. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I decided to check the mound again. In daylight, I noticed faint boot prints near it. They were partly washed out by frost, but they were definitely prints, not animal tracks. The size looked average, maybe a man's 10 or 11. They led away into the trees, but after 20 feet or so, they vanished into a patch of frozen grass. That afternoon, I felt restless, uneasy. I kept glancing toward the tree line as I chopped more wood, certain I'd see movement, but nothing showed. Still, I kept the lantern burning bright when night fell. Sometime after midnight, I heard the footsteps again, this time on the porch. The boards creaked, slow and heavy. My throat went dry. I reached for the hatchet I'd kept by the bed. The sound moved toward the door. The latch rattled lightly, like someone was testing it. Then, after what felt like a full minute, the boards creaked again, retreating, and the night went still. At dawn, I stepped outside. There were fresh prints in the frost, leading from the trees to the porch and back again. Same size as before. They were spaced close, like whoever made them was walking slowly. I followed them to the edge of the clearing, but they disappeared among the pines. I didn't pack up immediately. I don't know why. Maybe I told myself I was overreacting, that it was some lost hiker or trapper who'd gotten curious. But I kept thinking about the latch moving in the dark. That evening, I didn't light the lantern. I sat in the dark with my back to the wall, the hatchet in my lap. The stove was cold. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They came from the same direction, slow, measured. I held my breath. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin once, twice, and then faded into the woods. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I stuffed my gear into the duffel, slung it over my shoulder, and left without breakfast. The air was still and cold, and I felt the hairs on my neck prickle the whole walk back to the dirt road. When I reached my truck, there was something tucked under the wiper, a scrap of paper, folded once. I opened it with stiff fingers. Inside, in messy block letters, was a single line, "Don't come back." There was no signature. The paper was damp. The ink smudged like it had been left overnight. I stood there for a long minute, the silence of the woods pressing in. Then I crumpled it and tossed it into the truck bed. I never told my friend about it. I just handed him back the cabin key a week later and said it wasn't for me. And I've never been back past the border of that county since. I was 34 when it happened. I'd been living in Boston for years, stuck in the loop of work, rent, repeat. That fall, I decided to take a long weekend alone. No phone service, no meetings, no human contact. Just me, a few books, and the kind of quiet you can only find where the roads turn to dirt. A friend had told me about an old cabin he used once up in northern Vermont, near a stretch of woods called Bear Creek. The place was supposedly forgotten by most people, the kind of property you don't find online. Just a name and some faded directions written on a piece of paper. It wasn't rustic chic or any Instagram-ready spot. It was the real thing, with stove for heat, pump for water, outhouse 50 feet from the back door. I drove up on a Thursday in late October, the last orange leaves clinging to the trees like stubborn sparks. The road narrowed until the map on my dashboard was just a blank stretch of green. From the last small town, it was another 20 miles along winding 2-lane roads, then another 3 on gravel, and finally 1 slow mile of ruts and roots. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the hills and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke from some unseen neighbor far off. The cabin itself was 1 story, weathered dark brown, with a sagging front porch and a tin roof dull from years of rain. There was no lock on the door, just a heavy latch you could slide from the inside. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by spruce and maple, the tree line only 20 feet from the back wall. The only sound was the wind pressing through the branches. Inside was as simple as it got. 1 main room with a wood stove in the corner, a narrow bed under the window, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a set of open shelves stocked with some basic supplies. Matches, candles, a few pots. The floor creaked with every step. The air had that cold, dusty stillness of a place shut tight for months. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire in the stove, and heated a can of soup while the dark folded in around the cabin. The first night was uneventful. I read by lantern until my eyes hurt, then shut it off and listened to the fire die down. The quiet out there isn't like the quiet in the city. It has a weight. Every small noise stands out. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the scuff of something moving outside. I told myself it was just the wind or a squirrel. The second day, Friday, I hiked a little trail that ran along Bear Creek itself. The water was low but still moving fast, clear enough to see every smooth stone on the bottom. There were no signs of other hikers, no boot prints, no trash, nothing. I walked for hours until the trail just stopped at a wall of brush. When I turned back, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, though I couldn't say why. That night, it got colder. I fed the stove more wood and sat in the chair by the window, watching the trees sway. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not an animal scurrying, something heavier, slower. The sound of a foot pressing down on dead leaves. It happened 3 times, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath, and finally convinced myself it was a deer moving through the clearing. On Saturday, I decided to check the small shed behind the cabin. The door was swollen from rain, but I pulled it open. Inside was a rusted axe, a few rotting boards, and an old canvas tarp folded in the corner. On the floor, under a layer of dust, I noticed several marks in the dirt. Straight lines, like something heavy had been dragged out. They weren't fresh, but they unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I spent the afternoon splitting some kindling, trying to shake it off. But when the sun started setting, I felt that same low-level unease as the night before. The air was sharp enough to see my breath inside if I stood too far from the stove. I made dinner, read a few pages, and went to bed early. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was almost completely dark except for a faint silver light from the moon outside. At first I thought it was the cold that woke me, but then I heard it again. That sound of weight on dry leaves. A slow step, then another. They were close, right outside the wall near my bed. My skin went tight all over. I stayed still, barely breathing. There was a pause, then the sound of something brushing the wall itself. A scrape, then nothing. I waited what felt like hours before moving, and even then I only inched my hand toward the stove poker leaning by the bed. I didn't light the lamp. I just lay there until exhaustion pulled me under. Sunday morning, I found fresh prints in the dirt just beyond the porch. Not boot prints exactly, they were too worn down to tell for sure, but definitely not animal tracks. They circled the cabin once, then headed toward the trees. I followed them for maybe 30 yards before they faded into the leaf litter. My chest felt hollow as I walked back. I kept telling myself it was probably just some hunter or local passing through. But why circle the cabin? I kept busy all day, stacking wood and cleaning up inside, but every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard something out in the trees. By sunset, my nerves were raw. I decided I'd leave at first light the next day. That night, the sounds started earlier. Maybe 10 p.m. A step, a pause, another step. Then the sound of the shed door straining on its hinges. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, gripping the stove poker. The shed door gave a long creak, then silence again. The wind moved through the trees, masking anything smaller. I didn't sleep. When the first gray light showed through the window, I packed my bag in under 5 minutes. I stepped outside into the cold morning and scanned the clearing. The shed door was half open. I forced myself to walk over and push it shut. Inside, the axe was gone. The drive back down that narrow mile of rutted road felt like a lifetime. I didn't see another car until I hit the highway. When I got home, I put the cabin out of my mind, or I tried to. A week later, I was scrolling through the local news online when I saw a headline: Hunter found dead near Bear Creek. Foul play suspected. The article was brief. No arrests. No details beyond injuries consistent with assault. I never told anyone about the tracks or the missing axe. I never went back to Bear Creek. I don't plan to. It was early October of 1997 when I decided to spend a week alone in the small cabin my uncle had left me in his will. I was 32, recently divorced, and in no mood to be around people. The cabin sat on the north edge of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, far from the nearest town. It was one of those weather-beaten wooden places you could easily miss if you didn't know it was there. The gravel road leading to it ran for about 7 miles off the main highway and was barely maintained. Potholes were deep enough to swallow the tires if you weren't careful. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a single story with a small front porch, a rusted metal roof, and with siding that had gone gray from years of wind and snow. The windows were old but intact, framed with peeling white paint. Behind it was nothing but thick pine forest. Out front, a narrow trail led down to a dark, cold lake about a quarter-mile away. No electricity, no cell service, just a small wood stove and a hand pump for water. The first day was uneventful. I unloaded my supplies: canned food, a few gallons of water, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and an old .22 rifle I brought more for comfort than necessity. The air had that sharp autumn bite, and the smell of damp earth and pine sap was heavy. I liked it. I told myself this was exactly what I needed: silence and space. By the second night, I noticed the quiet wasn't as relaxing as I'd imagined. When you're alone in a place like that, silence isn't really silent. The woods are always moving, branches cracking, leaves rustling, unseen animals shifting around. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to something crunching slowly through the leaves just outside the cabin. It wasn't loud enough to be a deer. The steps were too steady. I told myself it was probably a raccoon and forced my eyes shut. On the third morning, I found something strange. The small pile of split firewood I had stacked against the porch was scattered. Not just knocked over, but spread out in a line, almost like someone had dragged the pieces away and then dropped them. I thought maybe a bear had passed through during the night, though there were no claw marks or obvious signs of digging. I res-tacked it, trying not to think much of it. That night, I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of something tapping against the wall near my head. It was light, like a branch swaying in the wind, except there was no wind. The air was dead still. I lit my lantern and listened hard. The tapping stopped. I sat there for 10 minutes, straining to hear anything, but the woods had gone unnervingly quiet. No insects, no movement, just that heavy, waiting kind of silence. By the fourth day, the unease had sunk in deep enough that I started noticing little changes. The hand pump outside, which had worked fine before, suddenly had a sluggish resistance. The ground around it was wet, more than it should have been, as if someone had been running it constantly. Then I saw faint boot prints leading away from it, too large to be mine. They headed toward the tree line and disappeared. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I began keeping the rifle within arm's reach. I made sure the shutters were closed at night. I also began to notice the same single bird call, far off in the woods, at almost the same time each evening, right before dusk. It was short, sharp, and always came from the same direction. I couldn't see anything when I looked. The fifth night was when I decided something was definitely wrong. I woke up again in the early hours, but this time it wasn't tapping. It was the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. They crunched on the leaves, then paused, then crunched again. I sat completely still, my heart pounding, gripping the rifle in the dark. I didn't dare light the lantern. The steps went around twice, then faded toward the woods. At first light, I went outside and found more boot prints in the dirt around the cabin, the same size as before. Whoever it was had been close enough to reach out and touch the walls. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the idea of walking that trail to my truck, with whoever was out there possibly watching, made my stomach knot up. On the sixth day, I barely left the cabin. I kept the shutters closed, listening for anything out of place. Around noon, I heard a faint metallic clink from somewhere out by the pump. I looked through a gap in the shutter and saw nothing. But when I checked later, the pump handle was tilted at an odd angle, like someone had forced it. The wet ground was even more soaked than before. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they didn't just circle. They stopped right outside the front door. I held my breath. The sound of slow, shallow breathing came through the thin wood. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then there was a dragging noise, like something being pulled across the porch. After that, silence. I didn't sleep at all. I sat there until dawn, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. When the sun finally came up, I saw a deep scratch in the wood near the latch. It wasn't an animal. It was from a blade, knife, or something similar. And there, in the dirt at the base of the steps, was a single fresh boot print. That was enough. I packed my bag, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and started down the trail toward my truck. The entire time, I felt eyes on me. Every sound in the woods seemed too close, every shadow too sharp. When I reached the truck, the driver's side door was unlocked. I knew I'd locked it. On the seat was a single piece of split firewood, the same kind I'd stacked against the cabin days earlier. I drove straight out without looking back. I never went to the cabin again. Later, after I was back in town, I told a friend who lived in the area about it. He didn't look surprised. He just said that every so often, hunters or drifters set up camps deep in those woods, and not all of them want to be found. Sometimes they watch places like mine for days before moving on. Sometimes they don't move on. That night, I lay awake in my own bed, far from the trees, and realized something that still makes my skin crawl. The firewood at my truck meant they'd been watching me from the very first day. It was late October of 1997 when I drove up to Hollow Pines for the first time. I had been working in a shipping warehouse outside Chicago, and I was burnt out in a way I hadn't felt before. My uncle, Greg, had bought a small piece of property up in northern Wisconsin years back. Nothing fancy, just a one-room hunting cabin on about 20 acres of mixed forest and marshland. He used to go up there with his buddies every deer season, but after his knee surgery in '95, he stopped making the trips. He told me I could use it whenever I wanted, and I figured a few days alone might clear my head. No boss breathing down my neck, no traffic, no endless drone of forklifts and packing tape, just some cold air, maybe a little fishing if the lakes weren't frozen yet. The drive took nearly 6 hours. The last 30 miles were nothing but winding, cracked two-lane roads, lined with bare maples and leaning pine trees. By the time I saw the narrow dirt turnoff for Hollow Pines, the sun was low and bleeding orange into the horizon. The cabin itself sat about half a mile down a rutted track, half hidden by spruce and cedar. It wasn't big, maybe 12 feet wide, 15 long, with a sagging porch and a tin roof gone dull with rust. The front steps creaked under my boots. The door stuck halfway open, like it had swollen with the damp, and the first breath of air inside hit me with the smell of dry wood and mouse droppings. It had no running water, no electricity, just a wood stove in one corner, a cot with a thin mattress, a metal table with one chair, and shelves of canned food Greg must have left behind years ago. The labels were faded, some cans puffed out like they were ready to burst. I set my bag down, lit the kerosene lamp on the table, and got the stove going. It was already dipping below freezing outside. The heat from the fire filled the room quick, but it left a weird, dry smell in my nose. Not unpleasant, just different from the radiator heat I was used to. By the time I finished unpacking, it was fully dark. The woods outside looked bottomless, the trees folding in on themselves. The only sound was the fire ticking and the occasional scrape of a branch against the roof. That first night was calm. I read an old paperback I'd brought, then killed the lamp and lay on the cot listening to the wind. I slept deep. The second day, I woke early and decided to walk the property. The ground was a mix of frost-stiff grass and patches of dark, soft earth. Greg had told me the back boundary was marked by a rusted barbed wire fence, but when I reached it, some parts had fallen, swallowed by moss and dead leaves. The land sloped down toward a shallow bog, the water black and still. There were deer tracks in the mud, and something else, long, narrow impressions I couldn't place at first. I crouched to look closer. They weren't boot prints, more like the marks of bare feet, but thin, with long toes splayed out, as if whoever made them had been walking on soft ground for years. The size was strange, too small, maybe a child's, but the distance between each step was wider than any kid I'd ever seen. I told myself it was probably just a weird trick of the mud. Animal prints overlapping, something like that. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder on the walk back. By late afternoon, I was splitting more wood near the porch when I caught movement through the trees. About 50 yards out, something pale flickered between the pines. I froze, axe in hand. It looked like a person standing just beyond the tree-line. No bright colors, no blaze orange like hunters wear, just a pale shape, still as stone. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. I stayed outside another minute, scanning the woods, but nothing moved. No crunch of leaves, no breaking twigs. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door, though the lock was just a thin brass latch that would barely stop the wind. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, faint but distinct, like something brushing against the cabin siding. Not the scrape of branches I'd heard before, but slower, more deliberate. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The noise came again, moving from one wall to the next, like someone circling the cabin. I sat up, listening hard. My heartbeat sounded louder than the movement outside. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there before I lay back down. When I woke in the morning, there were no tracks in the frost around the cabin. The third day was colder. I kept the fire going from morning till night. Around noon, I decided to walk toward the bog again to see if the prints were still there. They were more of them now, overlapping and tangled. The mud was darker, wetter, though it hadn't rained. I followed them further this time. They wound around the bog and into a thicket where the ground rose and dried out. That's when I saw the first piece of trash. An old enamel mug, dented and caked with dirt. A few feet away was a torn flannel shirt, stiff with age. I found more as I walked: a rusted camp stove, a boot without laces, the faded cover of a magazine from the early 80s. All of it looked abandoned for years, yet not buried by leaves or moss the way you'd expect. Felt wrong, like someone had been living out here, but moving around often enough that the forest hadn't swallowed their things completely. That night, the noise came again, but louder. I was lying on the cot when something thumped against the porch steps. Not once, but 3 times, evenly spaced. Then the sound of wood creaking under weight. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door. No knock, no voice, just the slow groan of the porch boards. Then the handle moved. It wasn't a quick jiggle. Turned halfway, stopped, then turned back. I stayed frozen, watching the faint line of light at the door's edge, waiting for it to widen. It never did. After maybe a minute, the boards creaked again, this time moving away. When daylight came, I checked the porch. Nothing, not even footprints, but the handle felt warm. By that point, I was thinking about leaving early. I could pack up, drive out, be home by nightfall. But something in me wanted to know. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe just stupidity, but I told myself I'd stay one more night. That afternoon, I didn't leave the cabin much. I kept the fire hot, drank coffee until my hands shook, and listened for anything out of place. It was quiet until the sun dipped, and then the forest seemed to tighten around the cabin. I killed the lamp early, sitting in the dark with my back to the wall, eyes on the door. Around midnight, it started again. First the brushing against the siding, then the slow steps on the porch. But this time, it didn't stop at the door. I heard something move along the wall toward the window. A faint tap, glass shifting in its frame. I reached for the hatchet I'd left by the cot and held it low, my palms slick with sweat. The sound at the window stopped. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. Then, from somewhere in the woods, a scream. Not human exactly, too ragged, too high, but not animal either. It lasted only a few seconds, then cut off sharp. Whoever, whatever, had been at the cabin was gone after that. I didn't sleep. Morning came gray and thin. I packed fast, throwing everything into my duffel without folding or sorting. I didn't even bother dousing the fire. I just closed the stove door and left the embers to die on their own. The drive out felt longer than coming in. Every shadow between the trees seemed to follow me. When I hit the highway, I didn't stop until I saw the skyline again. I never went back to Hollow Pines. Greg sold the property the next spring. He told me the buyer was some guy from Minnesota who wanted hunting land. I didn't tell him what happened, but sometimes when I'm up late, I think about those prints in the mud, the distance between each step, the way the handle felt warm, like someone had just been standing there, waiting, and I think about how, if I'd stayed one more night, maybe I'd have found out what they wanted. Or maybe they'd have found out something about me. I had been driving for almost 6 hours when I finally saw the small gravel road cutting into the trees. The GPS had been losing signal for miles, and the turnoff wasn't marked. Just a strip of gray stones sinking into the woods, darker than the highway behind me. I slowed the car and turned in, my tires crunching over loose rock. The air changed almost instantly. The road was narrow, lined with tall pines so close together they looked like a wall. Light from the late afternoon sun fell through them in strips, the shadows thick enough to feel like solid things. My headlights reflected tiny shapes darting into the underbrush, squirrels maybe, or smaller things I didn't want to think about. I was headed for a cabin my cousin had bought earlier that year. He'd sent me the coordinates and told me it was the perfect place to get away. He'd bought it cheap from a man who'd been trying to sell for years, a place apparently used for hunting in the 80s and then mostly abandoned. I'd seen only one blurry photo, a squat building with a green roof, surrounded by endless trees. The gravel road wound on longer than I expected. Every bend looked like the last, and I couldn't see the sky anymore. My phone sat in the passenger seat, map app spinning a little circle instead of giving directions. There were no houses, no signs, no other cars. Just the trees, the gravel, and the sound of my own tires. It was September, but the air felt colder here, like the shade had been trapped between the trunks for weeks. I kept checking my fuel gauge even though I knew I had half a tank left. It wasn't about running out, it was about how far I'd be from a gas station if I did. Finally, after what felt like an hour on that road, I saw a break in the trees. The cabin appeared in the clearing like it had been dropped there decades ago and left alone. It was smaller than I'd imagined. One story, made of weathered wood that had turned gray, the green roof streaked with black where rain had run down over the years. The windows were dark, reflecting nothing. There was a porch, half sunken on one side, and a single wooden step that looked like it might snap if I put my full weight on it. The clearing around the cabin wasn't grass so much as patchy dirt and dead leaves. No tire tracks, no sign anyone had been here recently. I parked in front, engine idling for a few seconds before I shut it off. The sudden quiet was sharp, almost pressing against my ears. Out here, the silence wasn't empty. It had weight. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the ticking of my engine as it cooled. I got out and stretched. My shoes crunched on the layer of old leaves. The smell was earthy, damp, like the whole place had been soaking in rain for years. Somewhere deep in the trees, something moved, slow, deliberate. A branch cracked, then it stopped. The key was under a loose board on the porch, just like my cousin had said. I stepped up carefully, testing the wood under my feet. It groaned but held. I pulled the board back and found a rusted old key wrapped in electrical tape. The lock on the cabin door was stiff, like it hadn't been turned in years. I had to twist hard before it gave way with a dry click. Inside, it was dim and smelled like dust and old wood. The air was cooler than outside. The floor was bare planks, worn smooth in places and splintered in others. To my left was a small kitchen, just a counter, a sink stained brown, and a fridge that looked like it came from the 1970s. To my right was a living space with a sagging couch, a coffee table with water rings, and a wood stove set into the corner. The only bedroom was at the back, past a short hallway. The bed was a simple metal frame with a thin mattress, a single blanket folded at the end. There was one window shut tight, the glass streaked with old rain. I set my bag down and went back to the living area. I didn't turn on any lights. There was power, my cousin had said, but I liked the natural light while it lasted. Outside, the sun was lowering, the strips of light between the trees getting narrower. I stood at the window for a while, looking out into the clearing. The cabin felt still, not in the peaceful way, but in the way that made you think it was listening. When night came, it came fast. 1 minute the clearing was dim, the next it was swallowed in black. The trees outside turned into tall shapes with no detail, just outlines against the darker sky. I closed the curtains. There was no cell signal, no radio stations, and no noise except the creaks of the wood when the temperature dropped. I heated a can of soup on the stove and ate it straight from the pot. The taste was bland, but the warmth felt good. After eating, I decided to check the locks. The front door had a deadbolt and a chain, both working. The back door, in the kitchen, had only a flimsy knob lock. I turned it, then pulled a chair under the handle for good measure. By the time I got ready for bed, the silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with tiny, irregular sounds. A thump somewhere on the roof, a faint scrape against the siding, maybe wind, maybe animals. Lying in bed, I kept listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not loud, just the slow crunch of leaves, somewhere outside. They circled, not in a perfect line, but in a way that made me picture someone moving around the cabin, stopping every so often. My chest tightened. I didn't move. The crunching stopped near the back wall, close to the bedroom. Then there was nothing. Minutes passed. I told myself it could be deer, or raccoons, or anything else that lived in these woods. When I finally slept, it was shallow, filled with short dreams of being in the same bed but not alone. In the morning, the clearing looked the same as before, still gray, cold. But when I stepped outside, I saw fresh footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal. They were shoes. The prints came from the tree line, circled the cabin, and went back the same way. I crouched to look closer. They were deep enough to tell me whoever it was had been standing still in certain spots, watching. I didn't finish my coffee that morning. I didn't stay the extra day I had planned. I packed my bag, locked the cabin, and drove back down the gravel road, the trees closing in behind me. I didn't tell my cousin, and I didn't go back. I left the main road just after sunrise, the old tires humming on cracked asphalt until the pavement narrowed to a single lane and then dissolved into gravel. The car shook and rattled every time a loose stone bounced under it. The steering wheel trembled in my hands. There were no signs, no painted lines, nothing but a dirt track that wound deeper into the trees. The GPS had already lost signal 15 minutes back, but I'd printed the directions. The paper was folded on the passenger seat, edges curled from where I'd gripped it earlier. Every turn was marked with a rough guess of distance. Left at the split after 1.2 miles. Sharp right past the red gate. Things like that. The man who rented me the cabin said it was easy to find if I just followed them exactly. The forest thickened the farther I went. The trees were packed so close their branches crossed over the road in places, filtering the morning light into long, thin stripes. I kept the windows up even though it was warm. Something about the stillness of the air outside made me uneasy. It took another 20 minutes before I saw the gate, a rusted thing hanging half open on one hinge. I slowed down, rolled over the uneven ground, and followed the road past it. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost like it had been dropped there. One story, with siding gone gray from years of rain and sun. The roof sagged a little in the middle. There was no porch, just 3 short steps leading to a door with peeling green paint. I parked beside it and sat for a while with the engine off. No wind, no sound. The silence wasn't peaceful. It pressed in on me, like the air was too thick. When I finally got out, my shoes crunched on the gravel. I could hear it clearly, maybe too clearly. I carried my bags up to the door. The key was heavy brass, left under a flat rock by the steps like he'd told me. Inside, the air was stale. It smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic, like old tools. The single main room had a couch pushed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a narrow counter that served as the kitchen. The floorboards creaked under my steps. The bedroom was at the back, barely enough space for a bed and a dresser. A single window looked out onto the forest. The glass was so dusty I could only see shapes of trees. The bathroom was the only place that seemed updated, newer sink, newer toilet. But the shower curtain was stained yellow at the bottom. I unpacked slowly, placing my things in neat stacks. I kept checking the window, catching myself glancing at the tree line like I was expecting movement. Nothing. Always nothing. When I stepped outside again, I noticed how quickly the light had shifted. The trees swallowed it early here. It was still afternoon, but shadows stretched long, dark, and heavy. The man who rented it had told me there were no neighbors for miles. That was part of why I'd come, to be away from everything. No traffic, no phones, no people, just quiet. But standing there, hearing nothing at all except the slow tick of cooling engine metal, I felt the first small pulse of something I couldn't name. Not fear exactly, more like the weight of being far from anyone who could hear me if I needed them. I didn't stay outside long. I had been driving for almost 7 hours before the turnoff came into view. The small green sign looked worn down, leaning slightly to one side, half buried in the snow from the previous night's storm. It read Larch Point 8 miles. I slowed the car and took the right, my tires crunching over the packed ice. The road wasn't really a road anymore, more like a narrow, twisting path between rows of dark pine trees. Branches hung low, heavy with snow, and every so often one would brush the roof of my car with a muted thump. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield despite the heat being on full blast. The air inside felt dry, making my throat itch. I kept checking the clock on the dashboard. It was already late afternoon, and the pale winter light was fading fast. I hadn't seen another car since leaving the main highway. The rental company had given me this small, beat-up sedan, which didn't inspire much confidence. The tires felt thin on the ice, and every curve in the road made my hands tense around the wheel. The cabin belonged to a distant cousin, one of those family members you never really meet until a wedding or a funeral. He'd said I could stay there for a few days to get some quiet and clear my head. I didn't ask for details about the place. I just wanted somewhere far away from people. When I finally saw it, the cabin was almost hidden by the trees. The wood was darkened with age, the roof heavy with snow, and the front porch sagged slightly in the middle. There was no driveway, just a flat space where the snow was packed down enough for me to park. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling metal. The silence outside was complete, the kind that makes your ears ring. I stepped out and the cold hit me like a slap. The air felt sharp in my lungs. I grabbed my duffel bag and the box of supplies I'd picked up earlier. Canned food, a few bottles of water, a flashlight, batteries. The wooden steps creaked under my boots as I climbed to the porch. The key was under a loose plank, just like my cousin had said. The door stuck for a second before swinging open. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. The light from the doorway spilled over a small main room with a wood stove in the corner, a worn couch, and a table pushed against the far wall. The air was colder inside than out. I dropped my things on the table and started the stove first. It took me longer than I'd like to admit. I had to hunt for the kindling and wood, and my fingers felt stiff and slow. When the fire finally caught, the orange glow made the shadows dance across the walls. There was no electricity, only a few oil lamps scattered around. I lit one and set it on the table. Its weak yellow light barely reached the far corners of the room. I checked the rest of the cabin. There was a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a heavy quilt that smelled faintly musty. The bathroom had no running water, just a bucket and an old metal basin. In the kitchen area, a rusty sink and a 2-burner propane stove stood against the wall. I tested the burners, and to my surprise, they worked. By the time I unpacked a few things, night had fallen completely. The window over the table was just a square of blackness, reflecting the lamp's glow. The wind outside had started to pick up, and every so often, the cabin gave a low groan, as if settling deeper into the snow. I ate a can of soup, the heat from the wood stove finally making the place feel less like a refrigerator. Afterward, I sat in the chair by the fire, staring into the flames. The silence pressed in on me. Back in the city, there was always some background noise, traffic, neighbors, sirens. Here, there was nothing except the occasional creak of wood and the wind. That first night, I slept lightly. The quilt was heavy, almost too heavy, but it kept the cold at bay. I woke several times to the sound of something brushing against the cabin, maybe a branch moving in the wind. Each time, I held still, listening, my breath loud in the quiet. Eventually, I would drift back under, though it never felt like deep sleep. The next morning, the air felt even colder. My breath came out in white clouds inside the cabin. I put more wood on the fire and boiled water for coffee. The trees outside were coated in fresh frost, the kind that makes everything look like glass. The sky was pale, almost white. I decided to walk down to the frozen lake my cousin had mentioned. According to him, it was less than a mile away. I layered up 2 pairs of socks, my thickest sweater, scarf, gloves. The path through the trees was narrow and uneven, and I could feel the cold seeping into my boots. Every sound seemed amplified: the crunch of snow under my feet, the occasional snap of a branch overhead. When I reached the lake, it was an endless sheet of white stretching out between the trees. The ice looked solid, but I stayed on the shore. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone else. The stillness made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. Back at the cabin, I noticed something strange. Near the porch steps, the snow looked disturbed, like it had been packed down by more than just my own boots. At first I thought it was from when I unloaded the car, but the pattern seemed different, wider, uneven. I crouched down to look, but the low winter sun was already making the edges of the prints blur. I told myself it was probably just an animal. That afternoon, the wind picked up again. By evening, the snow was coming down hard, the flakes thick and fast. I could barely see past the tree line. The woodpile beside the porch was starting to look small, so I brought in as much as I could carry. The air inside grew stuffy from the fire, but the thought of letting it burn low made my stomach twist. That night, I woke to a sound. Not the wind, not the settling of the cabin. Something sharper, like snow crunching under weight. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer, then silence. I stayed still for what felt like hours before I finally let myself drift off again. The next morning, I checked outside. The snow by the porch steps was churned up again. The prints were shallow, but they circled the cabin. Some led into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. My chest felt tight as I stood there in the cold. By the third day, I'd started keeping the hatchet from the woodpile inside with me. I told myself it was just in case I needed to split more kindling quickly, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was the tracks. They appeared every night, always in different places, sometimes leading to the back wall of the cabin. The storm didn't let up. My car was buried past the wheel wells, and the narrow road out was gone under a smooth white blanket. The snow was still falling, and the wind kept howling. On the fourth night, I woke to a faint tap against the wall. Not on the roof, not the creak of the wood. This was rhythmic, almost deliberate. I lay in bed, every muscle tense. Then it stopped. I could hear my own breathing. In the morning, there was a long, narrow mark in the snow under the window, as if something had been dragged. By now, I knew I wasn't imagining any of it. I started rationing my food without even deciding to. Every sound made my head snap toward the window. The fire never went out, even during the day. On the 6th day, I saw it. Through the trees, just far enough away to make me doubt myself. A figure, tall, bundled in heavy winter clothes, face hidden. They were standing still, half shielded by a pine trunk, watching the cabin. When I looked again, they were gone. I don't know how long I stood at the window after that, staring at the spot. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire, the hatchet across my lap, oil lamp glowing dim. The wind screamed against the walls, but underneath it, I kept thinking I heard movement. By morning, my mind felt frayed. I packed my bag, put on every layer I had, and stepped outside. The cold was brutal, but I didn't stop moving. The road was invisible under the snow, but I knew which direction it ran. My plan was simple: walk until I reached the highway, no matter how long it took. I made it about 2 miles before I saw the first sign of plowed pavement. My legs were shaking, my gloves stiff with ice. A county plow came around the bend, and I waved my arms until the driver stopped. When I looked back toward the tree line, the figure was there again, still half hidden, watching. I didn't wait to see if they moved. I climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and didn't look back until the cabin was gone from sight. I was 32 that summer, and for the first time in years, I had nothing pressing keeping me in the city. My job contract had ended in late May, my apartment lease was up, and I didn't have the energy to hunt for another crowded place with thin walls and traffic noise spilling in through the blinds. I needed quiet. Not the kind you get for a few hours in the middle of the night, but real quiet, where you can actually hear the air moving through trees and the creak of old wood under your feet. A friend of a friend knew about a cabin out near a lake in northern Minnesota. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find on rental listings. It belonged to some retired guy who mostly used it in hunting season, and apparently he didn't mind letting other people stay there for cheap as long as they kept the place in decent shape. The arrangement was simple. Pay him a small amount for utilities, haul your own water, bring your own supplies, and don't trash the place. I drove up there in early June with my old Honda loaded to the roof. Boxes of canned food, a couple large water containers, my sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a battery-powered lantern, a box of paperback books, and more instant coffee than I'd ever admit to another human being. The trip took most of the day. I left before sunrise and reached the small town nearest the cabin by late afternoon. From there, it was another 30 minutes on a cracked, narrow road that wound between thick stands of pine and birch before dissolving into a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. The cabin wasn't much to look at. Weathered wood siding, a sagging porch, a roof that had seen better days, but it stood solid. A single room inside with a small wood stove, a counter and sink on one side, the sink just drained into a bucket, and a narrow bed frame against the far wall. The only other furniture was an old table with 2 chairs, their paint flaking off in thin curls. There was no power, no running water. The lake was maybe 50 yards downhill from the porch, partially hidden by tall grass and reeds. I could see the glint of it through the trees as the sun dipped lower, the surface shifting between silver and dark blue. There wasn't another house or cabin in sight. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. The first night was still and warm. I cooked a small meal on the propane stove, sat on the porch with my plate in my lap, and watched the sun sink behind the tree line. The lake went flat and black. Somewhere far off, a loon called, the sound bending over the water until it seemed closer than it was. When I finally went inside and lay down in my sleeping bag, the silence felt almost physical. A pressure in my ears where city noise usually was. That silence didn't last. It was early November of 1997 when I decided to drive north. I had been living in Milwaukee for most of my life, working long hours at a repair shop, and I wanted to get away from everything for a while. The weather had been turning colder every day, and the thought of being somewhere quiet, surrounded by trees and away from the noise of the city, sounded like a relief. I had heard about an old cabin for rent from a coworker. He told me it was about 20 miles outside of a small town called Claremont, up in northern Wisconsin. Supposedly, it sat by a narrow, half-frozen creek, and it wasn't near any other houses. That was exactly what I wanted. No neighbors, no traffic, just me and the cold. The drive up there took nearly 5 hours. The last 30 minutes were the worst. The road turned to gravel, and I could feel every rock under the tires. The trees pressed in close on both sides, their bare branches arching overhead like the ribs of a tunnel. My car heater was on full blast, but it still felt cold inside. Every once in a while, I'd pass a rusted mailbox at the end of some overgrown driveway, but I didn't see a single person. When I finally saw the turnoff for the cabin, it was marked by nothing more than a leaning wooden post with the number 411 painted in faded black. The driveway was just 2 deep tire ruts in the dirt, partly filled with dead leaves. I eased the car forward, branches scraping along the doors. Felt like I was driving deeper and deeper into nowhere. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if it had been hiding behind the trees. It was small, made of dark wood that looked nearly black from years of weather. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch was tilting forward, supported by two uneven posts. There were no curtains in the windows, just the dull reflection of the gray sky. I shut the car off and stepped out. The air was sharp and still. I could hear the creek somewhere behind the cabin, a slow trickle of water under ice. I walked up the porch steps, which creaked under my weight, and unlocked the door with the key I'd been mailed. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old ash. The floorboards were uneven, and in some spots I could see where the nails had started to rise. There was a small wood stove in one corner, a table with two mismatched chairs, and a sagging couch that looked like it had been there for decades. The kitchen was barely a corner of the room, just a sink, a small gas stove, and a couple of shelves with chipped plates. The bedroom was at the back, with a single narrow bed and a window that looked out toward the creek. I dropped my bag on the bed and noticed the way the mattress tilted toward the middle. I didn't care. I was tired from the drive and just wanted to settle in. That first night was quiet, too quiet. I lay in bed listening to the creak of the walls as they shifted with the cold. Every so often, I'd hear a faint crack from the trees outside, maybe from ice breaking on the branches. I kept telling myself that was all it was. The second day, I decided to explore the area. I walked down toward the creek, my boots crunching through a thin layer of snow that had fallen overnight. The water was dark and sluggish, with patches of ice clinging to the rocks along the bank. There were animal tracks here and there, deer, I guessed, and something smaller, maybe a fox. The land on the far side of the creek sloped upward into thicker woods, the kind that looked like they could stretch for miles. By the afternoon, the light was already fading. I gathered some firewood from a stack behind the cabin and lit the wood stove. The flames were slow to catch, and for a while the room smelled more like smoke than heat, but eventually the metal began to radiate warmth. That night, though, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a sound, faint at first, then clearer from outside. It was like something dragging across the ground. A slow, deliberate scrape, then a pause, then another. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound seemed to circle the cabin, stopping now and then. I thought about looking out the window, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to move. After what felt like forever, it stopped. I waited another hour before I finally drifted off. The next morning, I went outside to check. The snow was thin, but enough had fallen overnight to catch marks. Around the cabin, I saw a faint trail, long, shallow grooves in the snow, leading off toward the trees. I knelt down and touched them. They weren't deep, but they weren't random either. Whatever made them had moved with purpose. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen and been dragged by the wind. But the air was still and the grooves were too straight. For the rest of the day, I stayed inside. I read a paperback I had brought, made some tea, and tried not to think about it. But when the sun went down, the unease came back. I double-checked the lock on the door and pushed the couch a little closer to it, just in case. The scraping came again that night, louder, closer. I sat in the dark, listening to it move along the wall outside the bedroom. My throat was dry, and I could hear my own heartbeat. I kept trying to think of rational explanations, but every possibility felt thin. When it stopped, I didn't sleep. I just waited for morning. By the fourth day, I knew I wanted to leave. The feeling in the cabin had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was like the walls were holding in something I didn't want to be near. But when I went to start my car, the engine wouldn't turn over. It wasn't the battery. It wasn't the starter. I had worked on cars for years, but no matter what I tried, it wouldn't start. That night, I built the fire higher than before and sat at the table with the light on. The scraping didn't come, but every so often, I thought I saw something move in the dark outside the window, a shift in the blackness between the trees. The last night was the worst. The scraping started earlier, just after sunset. This time, it didn't circle, came straight to the porch. The steps groaned, slow and heavy. I could hear the boards bending under weight. I didn't move, I just stared at the door. There was a pause, long enough for me to wonder if it had left, and then something slid slowly across the porch boards. Not footsteps, not an animal, something being pulled. I sat there until the fire went out and the room turned cold. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally rose, I packed my bag and decided to walk. I didn't care how far it was to the nearest town. I locked the cabin door behind me and left the key under the mat. About 100 yards into the trees, I found it. The grooves, the same long, shallow marks I'd seen before, but deeper now and fresher. They led from the woods to the cabin porch and back. Only this time there were no animal prints, just the dragging trail. I didn't follow it. I didn't look back. I kept walking until I found the road. It took me 3 hours before I saw the first car, and I didn't stop talking until I was safe in town. I never went back for the car. I still remember the smell of the cabin before I even reached it. That sharp, dry scent of old wood mixed with something damp, like moss left too long in the shade. It had been sitting up there for years, 20 maybe, and the man who owned it before me never came back after his wife died. I wasn't here for leisure. I wasn't here to get away from it all like the people in those travel articles. It was late November of 1997, and I had nowhere else to go. My lease was up in the city, and I didn't have the money to renew it. I had this cabin deed from my uncle tucked away in an envelope, something he left me in his will years ago. I never bothered with it before because it was too far out, too isolated. But now it was the only roof I could claim. The drive up was longer than I expected. Dry Pines wasn't even on most maps anymore. Just a smear of faded letters if you could find the right print. The road up the mountain narrowed the higher I went, until it was barely more than a lane and a half, winding like a snake between steep drop-offs and trees blackened with age. The last stretch turned into dirt and then into what barely passed for a path. The tires crunched through frozen leaves and small rocks, and I felt every bump in the steering wheel. When I finally saw it through the bare trees, the cabin looked smaller than I imagined. The roof sagged slightly toward the middle, the porch was half sunk on one side, and the windows were clouded with grime. The chimney leaned like it was tired of holding itself up. The door hung on the top hinge better than the bottom. I parked close enough to the porch that if the car died, I wouldn't have to carry my things too far. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust coated everything, thick enough to leave my palm print if I touched it. The living room had one sagging couch and a small table. A wood stove sat in the corner, its iron surface marked with old rust and ash stains. A stack of wood leaned against the wall, though some of it looked damp. There were 2 doors, one to a cramped kitchen, the other to a narrow hallway that led to the bedroom and a bathroom. I dropped my bag and walked the place in silence. The bedroom had a single bed with a thin mattress, its springs groaning when I pressed down. The window faced the trees, and the cold came through the glass like it was breathing on me. The bathroom was worse. The faucet was crusted with lime, and the sink was chipped. The toilet looked like it had been used last in another decade. I spent that first evening clearing out just enough space to make it livable. I swept the floors until the dust swirled in the air like smoke. I found a metal bucket and fetched water from the old pump outside. It groaned and sputtered, but eventually a slow, cold stream came out. I lit the wood stove, though it took me longer than I'd admit. Once the fire caught, the metal popped and clicked as it heated. The warmth didn't reach the edges of the room, but it was enough to sit near. That night, the wind picked up. It scraped over the roof like it was dragging branches across it. I lay awake in the dark, listening. The sound wasn't steady. Sometimes it was a long, low moan through the trees, sometimes sharp gusts that rattled the walls. Every so often, there'd be a crack from the woods. Could have been branches breaking in the cold. Could have been animals, but it kept me from sleep. By morning, frost glazed the windows, and the air inside felt as cold as the air outside. My breath hung in front of me when I got up. I boiled water for coffee on the stove and sat wrapped in my coat. There was no electricity here, no phone line. If I needed anything, The nearest store was about 15 miles down the mountain, and that was assuming the road stayed clear. The days bled into each other. I'd spend daylight hours chopping wood, hauling it inside, and trying to patch drafts with old towels and bits of cardboard. At night, I'd sit by the stove and read from the handful of books I brought. It was quiet, so quiet it made me uneasy. In the city, silence was rare and usually meant something had gone wrong. Here, it was constant, so constant that I began to notice every small sound. That's how I noticed the footsteps. The first time, I was half asleep, staring at the last glow of the stove. It was around midnight. I heard a crunch outside, deliberate, slow. Not wind, not a branch falling. A step, then another, then nothing. I waited, told myself it could be a deer moving past. But deer didn't stop and stand like that, not in this cold. I thought about going to the window, but something in me didn't want to see. Eventually, I heard the steps again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was hard with frost, but there were faint marks near the porch. Not clear enough to tell what they were, but not animal tracks either. They looked too long, too even. I told myself they could have been mine from yesterday, even though I knew I hadn't walked on that side. 2 nights later, I heard it again, this time closer on the porch itself. The wood creaked under the weight. Slow, careful steps. One. Pause. Another. I stared at the door in the dark, heart pounding so loud it felt like it was shaking the mattress. The steps stopped right at the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. The boards creaked again, lighter now, as if the weight was gone. I didn't sleep after that. When I checked in the morning, the snow had a new dusting from the night, but I could still see it, the outline of a boot print on the porch. Not fresh leather boots either, the tread looked worn, uneven. The print was facing the door. The days after that, I started keeping my axe inside at night. I stacked wood against the back door so I'd hear if it opened. But nothing happened for nearly a week. I almost convinced myself it had been some hunter passing through, maybe lost. Then, on the coldest night so far, I woke up to the sound of the pump handle moving outside. It was a metallic squeak, up and down, slow. The pump sat less than 10 feet from the bedroom window. I could hear it in the stillness, steady, like someone working it without hurry. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body tight. I didn't look out the window, I just listened. After maybe a minute, the sound stopped. Then nothing. No footsteps away, no sound at all. By morning, the pump was dry, the handle wet with frost. It hadn't been like that the day before. That day, I thought about leaving. But leaving meant loading the car, driving down that twisting road in the snow, maybe getting stuck halfway. It was safer to stay. That's what I told myself. The final night, it wasn't footsteps or the pump. It was the door handle. A slow, soft turn, just enough to make the latch click. I was sitting by the stove when I heard it. The sound froze me where I sat. Then another slow turn. Then the sound of the door pressing inward against the lock. The wood groaned under the pressure. I picked up the axe and stood as quietly as I could. The pressure on the door stopped. I waited, muscles shaking. After maybe 20 seconds, the boards on the porch creaked again. Not quickly, but one at a time, like whoever it was didn't care about being heard. I stood at the window and watched this time. The moonlight caught the shape moving between the trees. Too big to be a deer, too steady to be anything but a person. I couldn't see a face, just a dark outline slipping deeper into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. To first light, I packed the car. I didn't bother with half my things. I drove down that road faster than I should have, the tires spitting gravel and ice. When I reached the first real stretch of pavement, I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was back in town, and I didn't look in the mirror more than I had to. I never went back to the cabin. I signed it over to a man in town for less than it was worth. When he asked why, I just told him it needed more work than I could handle. I didn't tell him about the nights I heard someone walking the porch, or the sound of the pump in the dark, or the door handle turning while I sat by the fire. It's been years now. I live in a small apartment, and the noise of the street below helps me sleep. But sometimes, when the wind shifts just right through the alley, I swear I hear the faint squeak of an old metal pump. I had always thought that being alone in the woods would feel peaceful. Didn't. The cabin sat 100 yards from the tree line, but when the sun dipped behind the ridge, those trees turned into a wall of black. I had driven up here alone, a 4-hour drive from my apartment in Springfield, to spend a week away from work, phone calls, and the constant sound of traffic. The place belonged to a friend of a coworker, an older guy who didn't use it much anymore. He told me it had no internet, no TV, and no close neighbors. Perfect for resetting the brain. I had pulled in just before noon that Monday, August 8th, 2016. The gravel driveway was overgrown with weeds, grass pushing through the cracks. My car crunched over it until I stopped in front of the cabin. A small single-story structure with faded brown paint and a sloped tin roof. The boards on the porch were gray from weather, and one corner sagged slightly. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and old wood. The air was warm but still, like the place hadn't been opened for weeks. There was a small kitchen to the left, a main room with a couch and a wood stove, and a single bedroom at the back. The windows were all single-pane glass, with thin curtains that barely covered them. The first day passed quietly. I unloaded my gear: sleeping bag, a box of canned food, a cooler with ice, a bag of clothes, a small toolbox I always kept in my car. I set everything neatly on the counter or in the bedroom. The afternoon heat made me drowsy, and I dozed for a while on the couch, the faint ticking of the cooling metal roof above me. By the time I woke, the shadows outside had stretched long across the clearing. The tree line swallowed the light faster than I expected. I ate a quick dinner of cold chicken and bread, then sat on the porch with a flashlight and watched the woods. The quiet was deeper than anything I'd heard in years. No car noise, no hum of electricity, just crickets and the occasional snap of a branch far off. That first night, I slept fine. It was the second night when I noticed the noises. I'd been reading in bed, using a headlamp since the cabin's lights were dim and yellow. Around midnight, I turned it off and lay there, staring at the ceiling. The walls were thin enough that I could hear the night insects clearly. Then came a sound that didn't fit. A sharp, quick crack, like a stick breaking under weight, somewhere out past the porch. I froze, listening. For a few seconds, nothing but the usual chorus of bugs. Then another noise, a softer one, a kind of crunch in the dirt. Not rhythmic, not like an animal trotting, more like a slow step, then a pause. I told myself it was a deer. There were plenty of deer in these woods, maybe a raccoon nosing around. But I lay there, every muscle tense, until I finally drifted off sometime after one. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks I could see in the dry soil, no disturbed trash. I shook it off. By the fourth night, the noises were back, only this time they lasted longer. Around 11:30, just after I turned off the light, I heard it again. Crunch, pause, crunch, another pause. The sound was coming from the back side of the cabin, where the bedroom window faced the woods. The steps would stop for several seconds, then start again, moving just a little each time. I lay still, breathing as quietly as I could. I thought about getting up to look, but the curtains were so thin that if I moved them, anyone, or anything, outside would see my face instantly. The idea made my skin crawl. It went on for maybe 10 minutes before fading away. The next day, I walked the tree line behind the cabin. About 30 feet into the woods, I saw something odd. A strip of bark freshly peeled from a birch tree, about 4 feet off the ground. The wood underneath was pale and raw. It didn't look like an animal had done it. There were also 2 small pieces of cord lying in the leaves, black, frayed at the ends. I pocketed the cord without really knowing why. That evening, I debated leaving, but it felt ridiculous to pack up just because I heard some noises. I kept telling myself it was nothing. A wandering animal, branches falling, maybe even the house settling. Night fell. The air felt thicker than usual, hard to breathe in. At 12:14 a.m., I heard it again. Not behind the cabin this time, but at the front, Slow steps on the gravel of the driveway. The kind of sound a boot might make. The steps stopped. I lay there in bed, heart hammering. Then came another sound. A faint, dry metallic squeak, like a door hinge that hasn't been oiled. The front porch had a screen door that squeaked if you pulled it open. I sat up, holding my breath. Nothing else happened. No knock, no footsteps retreating. After a long time, I convinced myself it was my imagination, maybe the wind shifting something. But the next morning, when I went outside, I saw it. The screen door was unlatched. I was sure I'd latched it before bed. I decided I would leave the following day. I told myself I just needed one more daylight check, maybe take a walk out to where the driveway met the main road, see if there were any tire tracks. But I didn't make it to morning without incident. That night, I stayed up later than usual, sitting in the main room with the lamp on, writing in my notebook. I had the wood stove going, even though it was August, just for the comfort of the crackling sound. Around 1 a.m., the lamp flickered slightly, not unusual for a cabin with old wiring. But then I heard something else. A very faint, slow drag across the porch boards. Not a step, not a scratch, a drag. It stopped. Then it happened again. I turned off the lamp. The stove was still glowing faintly, giving me just enough light to make out shapes inside. I sat there, listening so hard my ears rang. The dragging sound moved toward the front door, then stopped again. I didn't move. Then, after maybe a full minute of silence, the screen door squeaked open, just slightly, just enough to make the sound. I stood up, heart pounding in my throat. I took the hammer from my toolbox. My hands were sweating so badly it almost slipped. The front door itself was locked, solid wood but old. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for a knock, a push, anything. Nothing. Eventually, I heard the screen door squeak shut, the dragging noise again, softer this time, moving away. When daylight came, I went outside. On the porch boards, right in front of the door, were 3 marks. They were parallel, each about 6 inches long, and they'd scraped through the dust into the wood beneath. I packed my bags immediately. By 9 a.m., I had loaded everything into the car. I didn't even eat breakfast. As I walked back to lock the cabin, I noticed something in the dirt by the edge of the driveway. A partial shoe print. The tread was worn smooth, almost flat, but I could see the shape of a heel and part of the sole. It was pointed toward the cabin. I drove out fast, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. When I hit the main road, I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back. A month later, I got a call from the coworker who had given me the place's address. He said the owner had been up there recently and found something strange. The back bedroom window had a tear in the screen, low down near the sill, like someone had tried to lift it quietly. The marks on the porch were still there, and just inside the tree line, he'd found a piece of black cord tied around a branch, hanging at eye level. He asked if I'd noticed anything unusual during my stay. I told him no, because by then I knew if someone had been watching me out there, I didn't want them to know I'd noticed. And I never wanted to think too hard about what would have happened if I'd stayed one more night. It was late October 2013 when I decided to take a week away from everything. My name is Daniel Wright. I was 32 at the time, working as a mechanic in Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't married, didn't have kids, and the shop had been wearing me down. 7 years of late shifts, noise, oil, and the same stale coffee every morning had me burnt out. I wanted silence. Not just quiet, but real silence. The kind you only get far from people, far from highways, far from anything man-made. A guy I knew from work, Trevor, had a family cabin up in northern Michigan. He'd mentioned it to me once when I said I wanted to go somewhere quiet. He told me it was deep in the woods, a place his dad built back in the late 70s. He hadn't been up there in years, said it was still standing, still usable, and I could take the keys if I wanted. I asked how far deep in the woods was, and he just laughed and told me, no cell signal, no neighbors, closest stores like 40 minutes away. That sounded perfect. 2 weeks later, I had his keys in my pocket, a cooler of food in the back seat, and my old sleeping bag rolled up in the trunk. I left before sunrise on a Tuesday, wanting to get there with plenty of daylight. The drive up was long, about 9 hours, most of it on long, straight roads bordered by flat farmland. But as I got farther north, the land started to change. The trees thickened, the air felt colder even though it wasn't winter yet, and the sky seemed lower somehow. I rolled the window down and it smelled different, clean but heavy with pine and damp earth. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, more like 2 tire tracks worn into dirt. My tires kicked up loose stones and brown dust as I followed the directions Trevor had scribbled on a piece of paper. No GPS, no signs, just keep left at the split, cross the old bridge, look for a rusted oil drum by a big oak, and so on. The sun was dropping fast, the golden light cutting sideways through the trees. I kept checking my watch even though I wasn't late for anything. I just didn't want to be driving through this maze of woods in the dark. I found the cabin right where he said it would be. It was small, single-story, built of weathered logs gone almost gray from age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one of the shutters hung crooked. There was no driveway, just a clearing where the grass had grown patchy and wild. The ground was soft from recent rain, and my boots sank a little as I walked to the front door. Inside, it smelled like dust and would smoke, even though the old black iron stove in the corner was cold. The floorboards creaked under my weight. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall, and a counter with a hand pump for water. No electricity, no fridge, just an old oil lamp on the table and a shelf with a few dented cans of food. I unpacked, lit the lamp, and got the stove going with some wood stacked by the wall. The air warmed quickly, and the shadows on the walls grew soft. Outside, the light was fading to blue. I sat at the table, ate a sandwich, and listened. At first, I thought it was silence, but it wasn't. There were tiny sounds everywhere. The pop and crack of the stove, the faint creak of the cabin walls. Somewhere far off, the slow knock of a woodpecker. It was peaceful, but there was something about the dark here that felt heavier than the dark back home. That first night, I slept hard. No streetlights bleeding through blinds, no trucks downshifting on the highway, just blackness and the slow breathing of the forest outside. I woke once, maybe around 2, when a branch cracked outside. Not a little twig, but something thicker like a foot stepping down on it. I sat up, holding my breath, but there was nothing after that. I told myself it was probably a deer. The next day, I walked the woods for hours. The ground was soft with layers of fallen pine needles. The trees stood close together, their trunks straight and tall, blocking the wind. Every now and then, I'd find an old tree with bark stripped away in long vertical scars. Trevor had told me bears did that, but only in the spring. I didn't see another person all day. Back at the cabin, I sat on the steps as the sun went down. That's when I noticed something strange. In the distance, past the line of trees, I saw a flicker of light. It was faint and only there for a second, but it didn't look like sunlight. It was too far to be a reflection from my lamp inside. I kept watching, but it didn't happen again. That night, I woke up twice to noises outside. Once it was the sound of something moving through leaves, slow, deliberate steps, then silence. Another time, I heard what I swear was the sound of metal scraping against wood. I sat up in bed, staring into the dark, waiting. Nothing. When morning came, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual, no footprints, no marks, nothing. By the 3rd day, the quiet had started to feel different. It wasn't restful anymore. It was like the air was holding its breath. I didn't feel watched exactly, but I caught myself looking over my shoulder more often. Around noon, I decided to hike toward where I'd seen that light. It took over an hour, and the ground started sloping down toward a small stream. On the other side, I saw something I didn't expect. A rough wooden shack, smaller than the cabin, with walls made of mismatched boards. It looked abandoned, but I didn't go closer. I stood there for a while, staring at it, and the longer I looked, the more I noticed little things. The boards weren't rotting the way old wood usually does. The door didn't hang open like you'd expect on a place left to the weather. It was shut tight. There was no path to it, no sign of firewood or trash, no footprints in the mud by the stream. I walked back without crossing over. That night was the worst so far. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the wall just outside my bed. It was slow, like fingertips dragging along the logs. Then a pause. Then again a little higher up. My mouth went dry. I lay there without moving, every muscle tight. The sound stopped after maybe a minute, but I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I checked that wall. There were faint smudges near the window, like someone had pressed their hand there, but the wood grain made it hard to tell. I decided to leave the next day. I told myself it wasn't because I was scared, but because the place wasn't as relaxing as I'd hoped. That afternoon, I packed most of my things so I could leave early. The stove had gone out, so I didn't bother relighting it. I sat on the bed in my jacket, waiting for night to pass. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of the front door rattling. The latch was bouncing in its socket, the wood vibrating. Someone was trying to push it open. Not slamming, not kicking, just slow, steady pressure. I got up, heart pounding so hard it hurt, and grabbed the heavy wrench I kept by my bag. The rattling stopped. I stood there in the dark, listening. My breath was loud in my ears. Then, outside, I heard footsteps moving away across the clearing. Not running, just walking slow and steady into the trees. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I threw my things in the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back at the cabin. 2 hours later, when I finally got cell service again, I called Trevor. I told him about the noises, the light, the door. He was quiet for a long time before he said, "Yeah, my dad stopped going up there after something like that happened." He didn't tell me the details, just said someone else was out there. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to know more. I've never gone back. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night in my apartment, I think about the sound of those slow footsteps walking away, and I wonder if they ever really left. It was late October 1998, and I had taken a week off from work to get away from everything. My job at the time was mind-numbing. Staring at a screen in a windowless office, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights for 8 hours a day. I wanted silence. I wanted to hear wind through trees instead of the chatter of people. I found a listing in the back of a local paper for a small cabin on the edge of Lake Monroe in northern Michigan. The ad was short and vague, just quiet lakeside cabin, wood-burning stove, no neighbors for a mile. The kind of thing you could tell was written by someone who didn't care much about selling it. That appealed to me. I drove up from Lansing in my old Ford Taurus, the trunk crammed with a week's worth of groceries, a couple of thick blankets, my toolbox, and a stack of paperbacks I'd been meaning to read. The weather that day was damp and cold. Low clouds hung over the highway like a lid, and the smell of wet leaves seeped through my vents. The directions from the owner were handwritten, full of turn left at the second dirt road kind of instructions. I lost my way twice. When I finally found the cabin, the sun was almost down. It sat in a small clearing, maybe 50 yards from the edge of the lake, with dark pines hemming it in on all sides. The siding was faded gray, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and there was a stack of split wood under a plastic tarp beside the porch. A single metal chimney stuck up from the roof, and smoke curled lazily out of it, which confused me because I was pretty sure no one had been there in weeks. The key had been left under a ceramic frog next to the door. Inside, the air was chilly, smelling faintly of damp wood and something metallic, almost like old pennies. The living room was just one large open space with a threadbare couch, a low table, and a cast iron wood stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a small bedroom and an even smaller bathroom. The kitchen was basically a counter with a sink and a propane stove. No fridge, just a large cooler the owner had left behind. It was exactly the kind of place I'd pictured. Quiet, plain, and far away from everything. But something about the air bothered me. It wasn't stale like you'd expect if it had been shut for weeks. It felt recently disturbed, like someone had been moving around in here earlier that day. I brushed it off. I unloaded my groceries, stacked my paperbacks on the table, and set about getting a fire going in the stove. It was already dark by the time I ate. A can of chili heated in a dented saucepan. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in steady gusts, the kind that make you feel like the whole forest is leaning toward you. The first night, I slept fine. I woke once, around 2 a.m., to use the bathroom and noticed the fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of wood as it cooled. No animal sounds, no wind. The second day was uneventful. I took a long walk down to the lake, where the water was flat and dark, reflecting the colorless sky. The air was sharp enough to sting my nose. I saw no boats, no people. The only footprints in the mud at the shoreline were mine. That night, something changed. I woke up again around 2 a.m., but this time it wasn't because I needed the bathroom. I couldn't say what had woken me. No sound, no obvious movement, but my heart was beating faster than normal. I lay still, listening. The fire in the stove was still going, just a soft crackle every so often. Then I heard it, a faint scrape from somewhere outside, not like branches against the wall. I'd heard that before. This was slower, deliberate, like something solid dragging against wood. I held my breath. The sound came again, and this time it seemed closer, maybe near the porch. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed, and crept to the front window. I shone the beam through the glass. Nothing, just trees and the faint shape of my car in the clearing. The scraping stopped. I stood there for a full minute, sweeping the light slowly back and forth. Finally, I went back to bed. My mind tried to tell me it was just a raccoon or a branch settling, but I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was damp from a light rain in the night, and I could see my own footprints from the day before, leading from the cabin to the woodpile and to the lake trail. But on the porch, near the steps, there were other marks. Not footprints exactly, but smudges in the dirt, like something had been dragged. I convinced myself it was nothing important. I spent the day reading and cutting some kindling from the woodpile. The air felt heavier somehow, like the sky was pressing down. That night, the sound came again. Later this time, maybe 3:30 a.m. The same slow scrape, then a pause, then another. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. I didn't go to the window this time. I just sat in the dark, listening. After about a minute, the sound moved around to the side of the cabin, then toward the back. I realized that whatever it wasn't small. You can tell just from the way weight shifts against wood. In the morning, I checked again. Behind the cabin, the dirt was disturbed near the back wall. And there was something else. A dent in the lower siding, small but fresh, with a smear of something dark. I crouched to look at it. It was mud, or at least I thought it was. By the fourth night, I couldn't relax. I lay in bed fully dressed, flashlight in one hand, my hammer from the toolbox in the other. At 1:47 a.m., the sound came again. This time it was louder, not just scraping. There was a faint thud, like someone testing the wall with their palm. I waited until it circled toward the back of the cabin. Then I moved to the kitchen window and looked out. I didn't see anyone, but just at the edge of the trees, I thought I saw movement. A darker shape within the darkness, there for only a second before it shifted out of view. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't an animal. By the sixth day, I was running on almost no sleep. I started leaving the lantern on at night, the light pooling weakly in the corners of the cabin. I considered leaving early, but part of me didn't want to admit I was scared. The sixth night was the worst. It started the same way, scraping, thuds, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of the porch boards creaking under weight. Slow, careful steps. They stopped just outside the door. I sat in the dark, holding my hammer so tightly my hand cramped. The steps stayed there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only minutes. Then slowly they moved away. In the morning, I found clear boot prints on the porch. Large ones, fresh. That was enough for me. I packed my things in record time, threw everything into the trunk, and drove away without looking back. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell anyone. I just left. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about those boot prints. about how someone had been walking around the cabin at night, watching, circling. I never found out who it was or what they wanted. But I know for certain one thing: if I had opened that door on the last night, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. It was late September of 2004 when I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin in northern Minnesota. I was 31 then, and life had been grinding me down for months. The kind of slow, heavy where that doesn't come from one bad thing but from a constant drip of little stresses. I thought getting away from everyone would help. The cabin belonged to a coworker's uncle, an old man who had long since moved to Arizona. It wasn't a rental. Nobody stayed there anymore. My coworker said the place hadn't been used in years except for deer season, and even then only for a night or two. I didn't mind the dust or the creaky floors. The idea of silence, actual uninterrupted silence, was too tempting. I drove up on a Thursday morning in a dark green '97 Ford Ranger with a bed full of supplies. The road narrowed the farther north I went. Towns got smaller, gas stations farther apart. By the time I was within 10 miles of the cabin, the paved road had turned to gravel, and the cell signal dropped completely. The driveway was nothing more than 2 dirt ruts between tall pine trees. I drove slow, partly to avoid wrecking the truck, partly because the woods seemed to close in tight around me. Even in daylight, they had a kind of weight to them, like something pressing down from above. When I reached the clearing, the cabin looked exactly as I expected. Single story, weathered wood, a small porch with 2 steps, and a rusting metal roof. There was no electricity, no plumbing. Water came from a hand pump out back. Heat came from a wood stove inside. I'd grown up in rural Iowa, so none of that bothered me. The first thing I did after unloading the truck was check the place inside. The door opened with a dull groan, hinges dry. The air smelled like dust and old wood, mixed with something faintly metallic. The main room had a table, 2 chairs, and the stove in the corner. A short hallway led to a bedroom and a tiny storage room. The windows had no curtains, just bare glass looking out into the trees. I spent the afternoon sweeping out dead leaves and mouse droppings, wiping down surfaces, and stacking the firewood I'd brought inside. The quiet was deep enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the stove cooling from the sun's heat on the roof. No wind, no birds, just stillness. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a can of chili over the stove, read by flashlight, and fell asleep in the creaky bed. But I woke around 3 a.m. without knowing why. The darkness inside was complete, so black it felt like a thick fabric pressed against my face. I lay there listening, but there was nothing to hear except my own breathing. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place and went back to sleep. The second day, I explored the woods. There was an old logging road about half a mile from the cabin that wound deeper into the forest. I followed it for maybe 2 miles until the ruts faded into grass and the trees closed in again. At one point, I saw what looked like the rusted shell of an old tractor, half buried in weeds. I noted landmarks as I went, a bent birch tree, a mossy boulder, just to be safe. That night, I woke again around 3 a.m., but this time there was a faint sound. Not footsteps exactly, more like the soft drag of something across dirt or leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. After maybe a minute, it stopped. I told myself it was a raccoon or deer and stayed in bed, but my heart was beating faster than it should have been. The third day, it rained. A cold, steady drizzle that soaked the ground and left the air smelling like wet pine. I stayed inside, chopping vegetables for soup and reading. By late afternoon, the rain tapered off, and the forest seemed even quieter than before. I stepped out onto the porch just before dark, and that's when I noticed something odd. In the soft mud near the bottom step were prints. Not boots, bare feet. They were small, maybe the size of a teenage boy's, and the toes were splayed wide. I counted 6 or 7 prints leading toward the porch, but none leading away. I stood there for a long minute, the evening chill creeping up my arms. Finally, I convinced myself they were old, maybe from some kid in summer months, and the rain had just made them stand out. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin made me sit up, flashlight in hand. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard it again, that faint dragging sound. This time it was closer, maybe just outside the wall near the bedroom. I thought about calling out, but with no phone signal and no neighbors for miles, what good would it do? I stayed still until it stopped. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft enough to take prints, but I saw nothing fresh. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself I was overreacting, that isolation can mess with your head. By the 5th day, I was tired, irritable, and jumpy. I decided I'd leave the next morning instead of staying the full week. I spent the afternoon cleaning up and stacking the last of the firewood outside. That night, just past midnight, I woke to the sound of the front door handle turning. Slowly, deliberately, my chest went tight. The door was locked, but the metal latch rattled softly as if someone was testing it. I grabbed the heavy flashlight and stood barefoot in the hallway, heart pounding so loud I could feel it in my throat. After maybe 10 seconds, the rattling stopped. I waited, muscles stiff, listening to the silence. Then, from the back of the cabin, I heard the faint creak of the porch step. I moved toward the bedroom window and eased the curtainless glass aside with 2 fingers, just enough to look. Moonlight spilled across the clearing. At the far edge, between the trees, stood a figure. Too far to make out details, but I could see they were barefoot, pants cut off at the knee. They stood perfectly still, facing the cabin. I stayed frozen until my legs ached, watching. Eventually, they turned and slipped into the trees without a sound. I didn't sleep again. At first light, I loaded the truck fast, barely taking time to check I had everything. The driveway back to the main road felt twice as long as before. When I reached the paved highway, the tension in my chest eased a little. But here's the thing that stayed with me all these years. When I got home and unpacked, I realized my small hatchet, the one I'd kept by the woodpile, was gone. I know I didn't pack it. I know I didn't misplace it. It had been leaning against the porch rail. I've never gone back to that cabin. I never asked my coworker about it either. Some things you don't need explained. It was late October, 1997, when I drove north into the mountains of Vermont. I was 34 then, a decade into my job as a surveyor, and I'd taken on an independent mapping contract for a logging company. They needed accurate terrain readings before they cut a new access road through the wooded slopes near Black Hollow. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid well, and more importantly, it meant a week away from people. I'd been given a small, unused Forest Service cabin as my base, a squat single-story place with weathered cedar siding and a rusted tin roof. The cabin sat about 9 miles from the nearest paved road, down a winding track that narrowed into little more than 2 ruts. No electricity, no running water except for a hand pump out back, and no cell service in those days. The company's rep told me there'd be a small propane heater and a couple of tanks already there, plus some basic supplies from the last person who'd used it. I figured I'd bring enough food for a week, just in case. The drive up that last dirt track was slow. Fallen leaves covered the road in patchy layers, and wet gravel spat up under the tires of my old Chevy Blazer. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Even with the engine running, the silence in those woods seemed heavy. I saw no other vehicles, no hikers, not even a deer. The air was damp and smelled of rot from the wet leaves. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, throwing long shadows through the trees. The place looked smaller than I'd expected. The shutters on one side hung crooked, and the roofline had a slight sag. But it was standing, and the front door was locked with a simple padlock, just like they'd told me. The key they'd mailed me worked fine. Inside, it was just one main room and a smaller back room with a cot. The main room had a battered wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, a small cast iron propane heater against the wall, and a shelf with some dented pots, a frying pan, and 2 old enamel mugs. The floor was rough pine planks, warped in spots from moisture. The smell inside was stale, old wood, cold ashes, and something faintly metallic, like rust. I lit a lantern, unpacked my gear, and set up the survey equipment by the door so it'd be ready in the morning. The first night was uneventful. I ate a can of stew straight from the pan, listened to the wind pick up, and read by lantern until my eyes hurt. When I finally lay down in the cot, the quiet pressed in so much that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. No cars, no voices, just the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The first signs. The next morning, the air outside was colder, with a faint bite that hinted winter wasn't far. I pumped water from the hand pump. It squealed loudly with each pull, and washed my face in the metal basin outside. My breath came out in small clouds. After breakfast, I packed my maps, the theodolite, and some markers, then headed into the forest to start the day's work. The woods around Black Hollow weren't just quiet. They were empty. I'd worked in remote areas before, but here there was something different about the stillness. Even during the day, I didn't hear much wildlife. No bird calls except for one or two far-off crows. No squirrels chattering. Just the wind moving through branches and the occasional groan of a tree shifting. The ground was soft with layers of wet leaves, so my footsteps were muffled. I was about 2 miles from the cabin, standing on a ridge to take readings, when I noticed something odd. A patch of ground where the leaves had been brushed aside. Not scraped like an animal foraging, but moved deliberately, like someone had cleared a small area. The bare dirt beneath was darker than the surrounding soil, almost black. I crouched down, ran my glove over it, and found it slightly damp. It wasn't a perfect circle, more like a rough oval, about 3 feet across. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe some old campsite or where an animal had lain down, but it didn't feel quite right. By late afternoon, the light was fading fast. I made my way back, marking trees as I went, and reached the cabin just as the cold started settling in. I cooked pasta on the small propane stove I'd brought and tried to ignore the way the woods seemed to press in on the cabin after dark. Footsteps. The second night was when I first heard it. I'd been asleep maybe an hour when something woke me. It was faint, a soft crunch of leaves outside. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon nosing around the pump, but the sound came again, slow and deliberate. One step, then another, then nothing. I lay there in the dark, listening. The heater ticked quietly as it cooled, and my own breathing sounded too loud. Then, after maybe a full minute, I heard it again, closer this time, on the side of the cabin where the back room was. Slow steps, not hurried, not shuffling. Human. I stayed perfectly still. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. The steps stopped. A faint creak came from somewhere outside, maybe the porch or one of the warped boards shifting under weight. Then silence again. I lay awake for hours after that, but I didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves, so I couldn't see any clear footprints. The pump looked untouched. The woods just stared back at me, empty. I told myself it had been an animal, maybe a deer, though the pace of the steps still bothered me. The second night. That night, I double-checked the padlock on the front door and made sure the back window was shut tight. I kept the lantern on the table burning low. I tried to read, but I kept glancing at the door. The air felt heavier somehow. It was around midnight when I heard it again. This time, the sound didn't come from one side of the cabin. It moved. A slow crunch of leaves started near the pump. Then it shifted toward the back wall, paused, then moved along the other side. I realized whoever or whatever it was circling the cabin. The steps weren't rushed. They weren't hiding. They were just steady, intentional. I thought about calling out, but the idea of letting whoever it was know I was awake felt worse. I just sat there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat hammer in my ears. After a while, the sound faded toward the trees. I didn't sleep again until dawn. I never really believed in bad feelings about a place. I thought that was just people looking for a story to tell later. You go somewhere old, you see some shadows, you feel a draft, and suddenly you've convinced yourself something's wrong. I always figured if something bothered you, it was in your head. That was before last October, when I stayed alone in a cabin at Miller's Creek. It was a small place in upstate New York, a little over 3 hours from where I lived in Syracuse. My Uncle Frank used to go there in the late 80s for hunting trips with his buddies. He bought the cabin in '91, hardly used it after that, and when he passed away, it went to my mom. She never once set foot there, didn't even want to. She told me the place was too far out, too isolated. I liked the idea of it, though. No neighbors for miles, no noise except the wind and the water. I'd been working 60-hour weeks at the warehouse, and I needed a break. So when October rolled in and I had 4 days off, I thought I'd drive up, spend some quiet time, maybe fish a little, read, and just be away from everything. I left early on a Thursday. The forecast said clear skies for the first 2 days, then rain over the weekend. It was cold for early October, highs in the low 50s, dipping into the 30s at night, but I packed enough layers. The drive was uneventful until the last 40 minutes, when the paved roads turned to gravel and then to dirt. The GPS lost its signal about 10 miles from the cabin, and I had to rely on an old printed map my mom found in a kitchen drawer. By the time I pulled up, the sun was dropping low behind the trees, throwing the whole clearing in orange light. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Single story, rough wood siding gone gray with age, tin roof spotted with rust. The porch sagged a little in the middle, and the railings leaned outward. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The main room had a wood stove, a threadbare couch, a small table with 2 chairs, and shelves full of canned goods probably older than me. The kitchen area was just a counter, a small propane stove, and a metal sink with a pump handle. In the back was a single bedroom with a double bed, a dresser, and a window facing the woods. There was no bathroom, just an outhouse about 20 yards out behind the cabin. I unpacked slowly, listening to the sounds outside. The trees swayed in the wind, and somewhere far off, I heard water running, the creek. The first night was quiet. I lit the wood stove, heated some canned soup, and ate with the window cracked so I could hear the wind in the trees. It was colder than I thought it would be, and the old stove didn't seem to hold heat well. Around midnight, I crawled into bed wearing 2 shirts, sweatpants, and socks. I woke once during the night to the sound of something moving outside. Not close, just faint footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. Out here, that was normal. I went back to sleep. Friday morning, I decided to walk down to the creek. It was about half a mile through the woods. The trail was faint, barely more than a depression in the ground with weeds growing over it. The air was crisp, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The creek itself was narrow but fast, the water cold and clear over smooth stones. I sat for a while just listening. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving behind me, deeper in the trees, but every time I turned, I saw nothing, just more woods. Back at the cabin, I made coffee and sat on the porch. Felt like the whole world was empty. No cars, no voices, not even a plane overhead. I started to realize why my mom never came up here. By late afternoon, the air had that strange stillness you get before a change in weather. The wind died down, and the woods felt heavier somehow. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that made you pay attention. That night, I woke again around 2 in the morning. This time, the sound outside was closer. Footsteps, slow, crunching on leaves. I held still in bed, listening. The steps stopped for a few seconds, then started again, moving along the side of the cabin. There was no curtain on the bedroom window, just the dark glass. I stayed perfectly still. Whoever or whatever was out there stopped again just beyond the wall. Then I heard the faintest sound of breathing. I don't know how long I lay there, barely breathing myself. Eventually, the steps moved away toward the woods. I listened until I couldn't hear anything at all. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. I half expected to see boot prints, but the ground was covered in leaves. If there had been any, they were lost in the mess of fallen oak and maple. I told myself it was probably an animal. Maybe a bear, though I wasn't sure bears walked that quietly. The day passed slowly. I fished at the creek but didn't catch anything. By evening, the clouds had moved in, heavy and low, and the wind had picked up again. Around 9 p.m., I heard something on the porch. A single creak like a foot on an old board. I froze in the chair by the stove. Another creak. Then nothing. I sat there for over an hour, straining to hear anything over the sound of the wind. At some point, I realized I was gripping the arm of the chair so hard my hand hurt. I finally went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there listening to the occasional groan of the cabin in the wind. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard the bedroom door creak. I didn't move. My eyes were open, but the room was pitch dark. My ears strained for the sound of footsteps inside. I heard none, just that faint creak and then silence. Morning came gray and wet. The rain had started sometime in the night. I told myself I'd leave early, maybe head back that afternoon. I didn't feel like staying another night, but as I packed, I noticed something. The door latch, the old metal hook, was unlatched. I was certain I'd hooked it the night before. That's when I saw the muddy mark near the bottom of the door. It wasn't a footprint exactly, more like the smudge of a shoe edge. I left less than an hour later. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and I didn't tell anyone what happened until now. I've thought about it a lot since. There was no sign of forced entry, no damage, nothing stolen. But I know someone was out there that night. I also know they were inside, even if just for a few seconds. And the thing that bothers me most, I didn't hear the door close. I don't think I'll ever be able to go back to the mountains again. Not after that week in January of 2018. It started as something simple. My uncle had an old cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, about 4 hours from where I lived in Virginia. He'd stopped using it after his knees gave out, and it had sat there untouched for years. He told me I could use it if I wanted to get away for a while. I'd just gone through a bad breakup and thought being somewhere quiet would be good for me. The cabin wasn't much. 2 small rooms, a tiny bathroom with pipes that froze most winters, a wood stove, and a back deck that looked out over a slope of dense trees. The roof sagged a little, and the porch steps felt soft under my boots. I drove up in my old Jeep, the snow starting to spit just as I pulled off the main road onto the gravel path that led up to the property. The path was rutted and partly iced over, and the Jeep's tires slipped more than once. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. The temperature had dropped fast, the kind of cold that makes your nose burn when you breathe in. Inside, it smelled like dust and stale air. I lit the propane lamp, its hiss the only sound in the room, and dropped my bag on the creaky bed frame. The cabin had no electricity, just the propane lamps and the wood stove. I stacked a fire in it, listening to the snap of kindling and the slow pop of resin in the logs. That first night was quiet except for the wind. The trees outside groaned when the gusts hit them, and every so often, something, a branch maybe, would knock against the cabin wall. I was used to city noise, so the silence felt heavy. I fell asleep under a heap of blankets, the stove's glow barely reaching the corners of the room. The second day, I hiked the ridge trail behind the cabin. It had snowed a little overnight, not much, but enough to powder the ground. The air was so clean it almost felt sharp. My boots crunched through the thin crust of ice on top of the snow. I saw deer tracks here and there, and once the deep clawed prints of something bigger. Maybe a black bear, though they should have been hibernating. When I got back in the afternoon, I noticed something strange near the cabin. A set of footprints in the snow came out of the tree line about 20 yards back, stopped maybe 10 feet from the back deck, and then went back the way they came. The prints were large, bigger than mine, and spaced wider apart. At first I thought maybe a hunter had wandered through, but there was no reason for anyone to be back there. The land for miles belonged to my uncle or his neighbors, and both places were empty this time of year. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just someone cutting through. Still, I found myself checking the treeline more often that evening. That night, I woke to the sound of snow sliding off the roof. It was just a soft whump, but in the stillness it felt like a shout. I listened for a while, waiting for something else. I thought I heard faint crunching, like someone walking in the snow outside, but when I strained to hear it again, there was only the wind. On the third day, the snow fell heavier. I stayed inside most of the morning, reading by the stove, my feet propped close enough to feel the heat through my socks. By mid-afternoon, I stepped outside to bring in more wood and froze in the doorway. The same footprints were back. This time they came from the opposite side, looping closer to the cabin before disappearing into the trees again. The snow around them was fresh, no melt, no crusting, meaning they had been made sometime in the last couple of hours. It wasn't just the prints that unsettled me. It was how they stopped, always within sight of the cabin, as if whoever it was stood there for a while, just watching. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was some local out checking traps. Maybe they were curious about the cabin. But that didn't explain the way the tracks doubled back, neat and deliberate. That night, I barely slept. I kept the stove low, not wanting the light to show through the cracks in the curtains. Every creak of the cabin made my chest tighten. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. A soft scrape along the porch, not an animal's shuffle. Slower, human. I didn't move. My ears rang with the strain of listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but I stayed awake until the gray of morning. On the 4th day, I packed my bag. I told myself I was just leaving early because the weather was supposed to turn bad. But deep down, I knew I didn't want to stay another night. When I stepped out to load the Jeep, my stomach sank. The footprints weren't just near the cabin now, they were on the porch. They went right up to the door. The snow on the steps was disturbed in uneven patches, like whoever had been there stood for a long time before leaving. I didn't bother with breakfast. I shoved everything into the Jeep, scraping frost off the windshield with my sleeve. The driveway was half buried in snow, the Jeep's tires spinning before catching. As I eased onto the gravel road, I glanced once in the mirror. There, just at the edge of the trees, a dark shape stood still, too still for an animal. I didn't look again. I kept my eyes on the road, hands tight on the wheel, until the cabin was gone from sight. I never told my uncle what I saw. I just said the trip was fine, that I'd probably use the place again sometime. But I never will. Every winter since, I've thought about those footprints, how they came closer each day, how the last set was only a thin strip of wood away from me, and how, if the snow had fallen heavier that night instead of the next morning, I might have never seen them at all. I was 32 that winter, living in Columbus, Ohio, working as a freelance mechanic out of a rented garage space. I didn't have much of a social life back then. I was newly divorced, and after the papers were signed in late September, I found myself craving a kind of isolation that wasn't just closing the blinds and sitting in my apartment with a beer. I wanted silence, but more than that, I wanted somewhere no one could find me for a few days. A buddy from high school had mentioned years ago that his uncle had a hunting cabin somewhere in the hills near Owsley County, Kentucky. At the time, I brushed it off, but one night in early December, I texted him and asked if that place was still around. He gave me his uncle's number, and by the next evening, I'd arranged to rent it for 4 nights for a couple $100. No running water, no cell service, with stove for heat. It sounded exactly like what I wanted. The drive down took just under 6 hours. I left Columbus before sunrise, stopping once in Cincinnati for coffee and gas, then again at a little general store 30 minutes from the cabin to stock up on canned food, bottled water, and some cheap whiskey. The cashier, a woman in her 60s with pale blue eyes, asked if I was going hunting. I told her no, just staying up there for a few days. She said something about how it gets dark fast up in the ridges and gave me a strange look, but I was already thinking about the wood stove and the quiet. The cabin sat at the end of a half-mile dirt track, barely wide enough for my Tacoma. There was no real driveway, just a patch of frozen mud and gravel in front of the porch. It was a squat, single-room structure with faded red paint peeling off the siding and a rusted chimney leaning slightly toward the treeline. The porch boards groaned under my boots, and when I unlocked the door, I was hit with the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, probably the stove. Inside was simple: a narrow cot against the left wall, a wood-burning stove in the center, a small counter with a propane camp stove on top, and a single shuttered window looking out into the trees. No electricity, no plumbing, just a 5-gallon bucket in the corner with a toilet seat lid. I dropped my bags and started stacking the firewood that was piled against the far wall. The cold air inside bit at my fingers even through my gloves. The first day was easy. I unpacked, lit the stove, heated up a can of chili, and sat on the cot with a book until the light started to fade. Out here, the sky didn't dim gradually. It was like someone just turned a dial from gray to black in under 20 minutes. By 5:30, I had the lanterns lit and the stove going hard. I remember stepping outside to piss before bed and noticing how utterly silent it was. Not quiet, silent. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Just the sound of my own breath frosting in the air. The second day started uneventfully. I chopped some of the firewood into smaller pieces, hiked about a mile down a game trail, and sat on a rock to eat a sandwich. The woods were bare and brown, with a thin crust of frost on the leaves. My boots crunched loud in the stillness. At one point I heard something, maybe a branch snapping, but when I turned, there was nothing but trees. I figured it was a deer. That night, I woke up sometime after midnight. The stove had burned low, and the air in the cabin had a sharp, frozen edge to it. I got up, stirred the embers, added a couple of logs, and went to the window to see if maybe the moon was out. It wasn't, but I noticed something strange. The dirt track that led to the cabin had fresh tire ruts in it. I knew they weren't mine. The mud was still soft in spots, and these ruts looked damp, like they'd been made in the last hour. The cabin wasn't visible from the main road. Someone would have had to know exactly where it was to come down here. I stood there for a while, staring at the darkness beyond the tree line, before finally closing the shutter. I told myself maybe it was a neighbor checking their own property, even though my buddy's uncle had said the nearest cabin was 2 miles away. I had trouble sleeping after that. The third day, I kept glancing toward the dirt track. In daylight, I could see the ruts more clearly, deep impressions from a truck with mud-terrain tires. I walked about a quarter mile up the road, but the trail curved sharply, and I couldn't see where they'd come from. Something about it made my stomach tighten, so I turned back. That night, I double-checked the door latch and stacked my remaining firewood inside the cabin, just in case. I was reading by lantern light when I heard it, the distant crunch of gravel and slow roll of tires. I froze, listening. The sound grew louder, then stopped, maybe 100 yards away. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I blew out the lantern and sat in the dark. My eyes adjusted enough to make out the faint line of the window frame. I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, but they were so light I couldn't be sure. My heartbeat was so loud in my ears it was hard to tell what was real. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard the crunch of gravel again, this time moving away. I stayed awake until I saw the first light of dawn pushing through the shutter slats. On the fourth day, I decided to leave early. The peace I'd come here for was gone, replaced by the constant awareness that I might not be alone. I packed up, doused the stove, and carried my bags to the truck. That's when I noticed it. Near the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet from the porch, was a cigarette but half buried in the frost. I don't smoke. It hadn't been there before. I looked up and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. No sound. Just that still, heavy silence. I got in the truck and started down the dirt track. About halfway to the main road, I saw where the tire ruts ended, in a patch of flattened grass where someone had turned around. No footprints, no trash, just the ghost of a vehicle's weight pressed into the earth. The whole drive back to Ohio, I kept thinking about how quiet those footsteps had been and how they'd stopped right outside my door. I never told my buddy about it, never told his uncle either, but I haven't been back to the woods since, and I still wake up some nights, especially in winter, thinking I hear the crunch of gravel and the faint sound of someone breathing just beyond the door. It was October of 1998 when I decided to spend a long weekend alone in the small cabin my uncle used to own. He had passed away the year before, and the place hadn't been visited since the funeral. My uncle was the kind of man who didn't care much for comfort. He had built the cabin in the late 70s himself, hauling wood and tin roofing into the hills by hand, so everything in it felt worn, uneven, and a little too quiet. It sat just under a ridge in rural northern Maine, about 3 miles from the nearest dirt road and a good 15 miles from the closest paved one. I had taken some time off work because I needed to think about a few things in my life. My job at the mill was wearing me down. Too much noise, too many hours, and too little sleep. My girlfriend had left me 3 months earlier, and I'd been restless since. The cabin felt like the perfect place to clear my head, to be somewhere where no one could bother me. I packed heavy. Enough food for a week, a small gas stove, 2 jugs of water, a sleeping bag, a lantern, and an old .22 rifle my father had given me years back. I had no cell service out there. None of that was surprising in '98, and I brought a hand crank radio just in case I needed to hear a weather update. I left early in the morning. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that cuts through even a heavy jacket. The dirt road leading to the trailhead was barely wide enough for my truck, and the maple trees leaned so far over it that their branches scratched the roof. I parked where the road ended and loaded my gear into an old external frame backpack. The trail to the cabin wasn't marked. You just had to know it was there, following a faint line through the birch and spruce. The first hour of hiking went easy, but the second was all uphill. My boots slid on wet leaves, and sweat ran down my back even though the air was cold. By the time I saw the roof line of the cabin peeking through the trees, my legs were burning. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods, with a narrow path leading around to the outhouse behind it. The roof looked intact, though the tin was dull with rust. The windows were clouded, but the glass seemed unbroken. I dropped my pack on the porch, fished the key from my coat pocket, and unlocked the door. It took a shove to get it open. The wood had swollen from moisture. Inside, the air smelled like cold dust and pine sap. The interior was just one big room with a wood stove in the corner, a sagging bed frame against the wall, a table with 2 chairs, and some shelves lined with old cans and jars. A pile of split firewood sat near the stove, gray with age but still dry. I set about making the place livable. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed and shook out a blanket I'd brought. I checked the chimney to make sure nothing had nested in it, then lit a small fire to drive out the damp chill. Outside, I walked the perimeter, making sure no animals had tried to burrow under the cabin. The ground was undisturbed, except for a few deer tracks by the treeline. Everything felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the air was holding its breath. That first night, I sat at the table with the lantern on low, writing in a small notebook and listening to the fire pop. The wind pushed against the cabin walls, but it was steady, nothing alarming. Around midnight, I turned in, pulling the sleeping bag tight around me. Sometime in the dark, I woke up to a faint crunching sound outside. I stayed still, breathing slow, listening. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing out here would have much interest in me. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and deliberate, then faded into the distance. I told myself it was just wildlife and fell back asleep. The next day was cold but sunny. I spent the morning gathering some fresh firewood from deadfall near the ridge, then sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the treeline. It struck me how alone I was out here. I'd been in the woods before, but usually with friends or my father. This was different. There was no other human sound, no hum of cars, no voices, nothing but wind and the occasional bird. In the afternoon, I decided to hike down to a small creek about half a mile away to refill my water jug. The trail was faint, but I remembered it from years before. The creek was low, the rocks slick with moss, and the water so cold my hands ached when I dipped them in. I filled the jug, slung it over my shoulder, and headed back. About halfway, I saw something odd. A section of the trail where the leaves had been brushed aside, like something had been dragged across. The marks were wide and irregular, leading off into the thicker trees. I stood there a while, looking, but I couldn't see far enough to make sense of it. Eventually, I kept walking. That night, I made a small dinner on the gas stove, then read by lantern light. The wind had picked up again, and every now and then, I thought I heard faint thumps outside. Each time I checked the window, I saw nothing but darkness. It was the third night when things started to feel wrong. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow, careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. My heart hammered in my chest. I reached for the rifle, keeping still. The footsteps paused, then moved toward the door. I could hear the faint creak of the wood under their weight. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the rifle across my lap, listening to the wind scrape branches against the walls. In the morning, I opened the door and looked down. There were marks on the porch. Muddy prints, not boots, not bare feet, but something in between. The shape was vague, maybe from the mud sliding, but they weren't from any deer or bear I'd seen. They led off the porch and disappeared into the leaves. I told myself it had to be some animal and tried to shake it off. I spent the day splitting more wood, moving slowly, my eyes always flicking toward the trees. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep much. The wind died down, and in the quiet, I could hear faint snapping sounds in the forest. Once, I caught a glimpse of something pale between the trees, but it was gone before I could focus. The fourth day, I found more disturbances. A patch of ground by the outhouse where the soil had been freshly turned, like something had been digging. No clear tracks this time, just loose dirt. I didn't go near it. By then, my sense of ease was gone. I kept the rifle close at all times. I didn't linger outside after dark. My hands shook when I tried to light the stove. On the fifth night, it came right up to the cabin again. I heard the porch creak, then the faint rattle of the doorknob. Whoever or whatever it was, they tried it twice slowly before stepping away. I stayed frozen, the rifle aimed at the door, not daring to breathe too loud. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I made my decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed quickly, glancing at the windows every few minutes. When I stepped out, I felt the hair on my neck rise. At the edge of the clearing, something moved, tall, thin, and wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see the face, but I knew it was watching me. I didn't run, but I walked fast down the trail, not looking back. Every so often, I thought I heard movement behind me, but I didn't stop. When I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine started. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Someone standing at the start of the trail, motionless, watching me go. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I heard from a neighbor who lived closer to that ridge that hunters sometimes saw strange camps deep in those woods. Makeshift shelters, fire pits, and clothes hanging from branches, but no one ever saw who used them. I didn't want to know more. I sold the cabin to a man from out of state. He seemed excited about fixing it up for hunting season. I didn't tell him about the nights I spent there or the figure at the treeline. I just handed him the key and wished him luck. Some places aren't meant for people to stay. It was the summer of 1998, and I had just turned 32. I'd been living in Phoenix for nearly a decade, where the city heat never really left the air, even at night. That year had been particularly hard on me. Long hours at work, a relationship that ended poorly, and an endless cycle of noise, traffic, and people everywhere. When a coworker mentioned their uncle had a hunting cabin up in northern Arizona, miles away from the nearest paved road, I didn't think twice. They said it wasn't fancy, just wood walls, no TV, no phone signal, but it was quiet, surrounded by forest. That was all I needed to hear. I drove up in my old '92 Chevy pickup on a Friday morning. The first 100 miles were easy highway, but after a while the landscape changed. Flat desert became rolling hills dotted with pine, then denser forest, and eventually a dirt road with potholes big enough to make my teeth rattle. My coworker had given me hand-drawn directions because GPS coverage was non-existent out there. Turn after turn, I followed them until the dirt road narrowed to what felt like little more than 2 ruts in the ground. I kept expecting to see the cabin around every corner, but it took nearly an hour of creeping along before I finally spotted it. It sat back from the road, tucked between tall ponderosa pines. The wood siding was weathered gray, the roof steep to keep off the snow in winter. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, one missing a slat. No cars, no other buildings in sight, just the forest swallowing up everything around it. I parked beside a woodpile, grabbed my duffel, and let myself in with the key I'd been given. Inside, the cabin was just one large room with a small kitchen area in the corner, a wood-burning stove, and a bed against the far wall. The air smelled faintly of pine and old dust. 2 narrow windows let in strips of light, and I noticed how still everything felt. No hum of electricity, no cars in the distance, not even a bird call at that moment. Just a deep, almost heavy quiet. I dropped my bag, checked the small fridge. It ran off propane just like the stove, and saw there were a few cans of soup, some instant coffee, and bottled water left from whoever had been here last. I brought my own supplies anyway. That first day, I unpacked slowly. I'd planned to hike later in the afternoon, but the stillness of the place had me just sitting on the porch for a long time, listening. When the wind moved through the trees, it was a low, soft sound, almost like a breath. Now and then a bird would call far away. It took a while for my mind to adjust to that kind of quiet, where the loudest thing was my own heartbeat. Around sunset, I made some instant noodles and ate them by the stove. The sun went down faster than I expected, shadows rushing in through the trees until the windows were black. I lit the small kerosene lamp, its yellow glow filling just the nearest corners. I'd been in quiet places before, but nighttime in that cabin was different. Without city lights, the darkness outside was thick, complete. I crawled into bed and read by lamplight for a while, but every little sound outside caught my attention. A twig snapping, the faint creak of wood in the cabin. I told myself it was just the forest settling for the night. By midnight, I drifted off. The first odd thing happened around 3 a.m. I woke up without knowing why. The cabin was dark, the lamp out, and the air had cooled. My ears felt tuned for something, like they were listening ahead of my thoughts. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A slow, steady crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles, somewhere behind the cabin. They weren't fast, not the hurried scurry of an animal. They were measured, like someone walking and pausing every few steps. I lay perfectly still. The footsteps came closer, then stopped. I didn't hear them again, but I stayed awake for nearly an hour, my eyes fixed on the dark outline of the window. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. The next morning, sunlight spilling through the trees made the night seem far away and almost foolish. Still, I stepped out back to check. There were no clear footprints in the pine needles, nothing disturbed that I could see. I told myself it had been a deer or maybe an elk passing by, heavy enough to sound like a person. It wasn't worth overthinking. That day, I hiked a few miles into the woods, following a narrow game trail uphill until I reached a rocky ridge with a view that seemed to go forever. Green forest rolling in waves all the way to hazy blue mountains in the distance. No roads, no houses, just a massive stretch of nowhere. I sat up there for an hour, eating a granola bar and letting the wind push against my face. I returned to the cabin in late afternoon, sweaty and tired, and spent the rest of the day reading. As night came, I made a small fire in the stove and heated soup. I told myself the first night had been nerves, but when I tried to sleep again, I found myself half listening for those footsteps. It was around the same time, 3 a.m., when I woke again. This time, the sound was clearer. Slow crunching steps moving along the side of the cabin. A pause. Then another few steps. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I stayed absolutely still, my breathing shallow. The sound moved toward the back again, then faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I searched again, circling the cabin slowly. This time I did see something. On the far side, near the base of one of the pines, there was a single scuff in the dirt, as if a shoe had dragged lightly across it. Could have been anything, but it looked fresh. By the third night, I was wound tight. I locked the door early, even though the only lock was a simple latch. I kept the lamp burning low and sat in the chair by the stove, listening. Hours passed, and I nearly convinced myself nothing would happen. Then there it was again. The same deliberate pace, the same pauses. Only this time, the steps circled the cabin entirely. They passed one window, moved along the wall, faded toward the back, then reappeared along the other side. I felt my skin crawl. I didn't move until dawn. When I finally stepped outside, I saw more scuffs in the dirt. Faint, but there. Whoever it was hadn't been rushing. They'd been walking slowly, taking their time, watching. By the fourth day, the peaceful getaway I'd imagined was gone. I was tired, jumpy, and second-guessing every sound. I considered leaving early, but the idea of driving the long dirt road in the dark made me stay put another night. That day I kept busy, chopping some firewood even though I didn't need to, just to feel like I was doing something. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the forest stayed empty. That night, I sat on the bed with my flashlight in my lap, not even trying to sleep. The first sound came earlier than usual, around midnight. A twig snapping, then footsteps again, closer. They paused right outside the nearest window. I could hear breathing now, faint but real. I didn't move, didn't shine the light. After a long minute, the steps retreated into the forest. I waited, heart hammering, for them to return. They didn't. First light, I packed. I shoved everything into my bag, loaded it into the truck, and started the long drive back down the dirt road. My hands didn't stop shaking until I hit pavement. I never saw anyone, but I know what I heard. Those footsteps circling the cabin night after night, steady and patient. I never went back. I still don't know why I decided to drive up there alone that winter. It was January of 1998, and I had a week off from work. I was 29, single, and restless. I wanted silence, a place where no one would bother me. A friend of a friend told me about a cabin deep in the northern part of Maine, tucked away near an old logging road that hadn't been used in years. It was cheap to rent because it was so far out and barely maintained. That sounded perfect to me. The drive up from Portland took almost 6 hours. The first 3 were on highways, then it was just narrower and narrower roads until they weren't really roads anymore, just hard-packed snow with ruts from some old truck tires. The map I had was from the mid-'80s. GPS didn't work there. My cell phone already had no signal about an hour earlier. I remember passing 2 gas stations after leaving the main road, both looking half abandoned, the kind of places with one pump and a dim office lit by a single hanging bulb. By the time I saw the cabin, it was late afternoon. It was smaller than I expected. 1 story, with siding gray from years of weather, a sagging porch, and a chimney leaning a little. The snow came up past my boots in spots. The nearest sign of life was a rusted mailbox with no name, just the number 42, barely visible under peeling paint. Beyond the cabin was forest. Pine trees, thick and endless, their tops vanishing into a pale sky. Inside, it smelled of cold wood and dust. The main room had a wood stove in the corner, a small table, and a bed against the wall. The floor creaked when I walked, and the air was still enough that I could hear my own breathing. A single window looked out at the trees. There was no running water, just a pump outside that I'd have to prime. No electricity except from a small, loud generator out back. It was exactly what I had wanted. The first night, the wind was strong enough to rattle the window. I fed the stove until the room was warm, then read a paperback by flashlight. I slept well. The second day was quiet. I hiked a little into the woods, not far, just to get a feel for the place. The snow was deep, and my boots crunched loud in the stillness. At one point, I saw tracks, deer, I thought, crossing in front of me. The air was so clean it felt sharp in my lungs. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed my own boot prints from the day before were already half filled by drifted snow. That night, something woke me. It was a faint metallic sound, almost like someone dropping a piece of cutlery onto a counter. I lay still for a while, listening. The stove was low, just a faint glow inside it. The wind was gone. The sound didn't happen again. I told myself it was the roof settling or the stove popping as it cooled. Eventually, I fell asleep. The third morning, I walked farther. I carried a small pack, water, a knife, and some trail mix. The forest was denser the deeper I went. The snow was undisturbed except for a few small animal trails. Around noon, I came across a structure. Not a cabin, more like an old hunting blind. It was half collapsed, covered in snow, with a broken ladder leaning inside it. On the ground nearby, buried under ice, was a rusted metal bucket and a torn strip of plaid fabric that must have been from a shirt. I stood there a while, looking around. Nothing moved. The silence was heavier out there. When I got back, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints leading up to the porch. Not mine, they were smaller and the tread was different. They came from the side of the cabin, stopped at the front steps, then turned back the way they'd come. I crouched down to look at them. They weren't crisp enough to tell much. Snow had fallen lightly, but not enough to cover them. I couldn't tell how old they were, maybe from before I arrived. Still, I'd been walking around the cabin for 2 days and hadn't seen them before. That night, I kept the flashlight closer to me in bed. The 4th day, the air felt heavier, like snow was coming. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping some wood from a small pile of logs behind it. As I worked, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A dark shape, but gone before I could focus on it. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was just the shadow of a branch moving in the wind, though there wasn't much wind. Late that afternoon, the snow started. Fine at first, then thick. By dark, it was a wall of white outside the window. I read for a while, then turned in early. At some point in the night, I woke to the faint sound of crunching snow outside. Slow, deliberate steps. They came from one side of the cabin, paused, then moved to the other side. I held my breath. My pulse was loud in my ears. The steps stopped. I didn't move until I couldn't hear anything. Then I lay awake for hours, the flashlight in my hand. Morning came pale and quiet. I checked outside. The snow was deep, almost to my knees. The wind had erased most tracks, but on the far side of the cabin, I found a shallow depression in the snow that could have been a footprint, or just where snow had fallen from a branch. Couldn't be sure. By the 5th day, I was restless. I decided to go back toward where I'd seen the old blind. The snow was heavier, and I had to work harder to move through it. The forest seemed even quieter than before. When I reached the spot, I noticed something new. A fresh cut in the wood of the blind, like someone had taken a hatchet to it recently. The cut edges were light, not weathered. That bothered me more than it should have. On the way back, I realized I'd lost track of the exact direction I'd come from. Everything looked the same: trees, snow, faint shadows. I had to stop and check my bearings twice. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, relief washed over me. That night, the generator sputtered and died around 2 a.m. I didn't bother restarting it. The stove kept the place warm enough. I must have dozed off again, because I woke to the faint sound of snow crunching, closer this time, maybe just outside the window. I stayed still, eyes open, waiting. There was no shadow, no face, no knock, just silence again. My hand was tight around the flashlight. The 6th morning, I made a decision. I'd leave a day early. The thought of another night out there made my skin crawl. I packed my bag and went to start the truck. It wouldn't turn over. I tried again, nothing. The cold had killed the battery. My stomach sank. I went back inside, sat on the bed, and thought. The nearest real road was miles away, and I wasn't sure I could find it in this snow without getting lost. I decided to wait until daylight the next day, then hike out. That last night, I barely slept. Every small sound set me on edge. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The slow crunch of snow circling the cabin. Not fast, not panicked, just steady. I gripped the flashlight and stared at the window, half expecting to see a face. It never came. After a long time, the sound faded. I stayed awake until the faint light of morning. I left as soon as I could. The snow was deep and heavy. I followed the old track from my truck as far as it went, then tried to keep a straight line. Hours passed. My legs ached, and the cold bit at my face. Finally, I saw tire ruts in the snow, fresh ones, from some larger vehicle. I followed them until I reached the main road. A passing truck picked me up and drove me into town. A week later, I came back with a tow truck for my vehicle. The driver, a local, was the one who pointed it out. In the snow by the cabin were footprints, several sets, leading into the woods. Some were small, some larger, all of them fresh. They hadn't been there when I left. I never went back. had been saving for months, not for anything big, just enough for a quiet week away from work and people. City life had been chewing at my nerves lately. Constant sirens, the hum of traffic, and my neighbor's paper-thin walls that made me hear every argument, every TV show, every dropped spoon. I wanted quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't possible where I lived. I didn't want a resort or anything fancy, just space, trees, maybe a small lake nearby, somewhere I could sit with a book or walk without hearing car horns. I ended up scrolling through rental listings late one night and stumbled on an old cabin by a place called Weller Creek, about 6 hours from my apartment. The photos were simple. Wooden siding faded to a silvery gray, a single porch light, and a dock that reached into still water. The description was straightforward. Cabin for rent, 1 bedroom, no Wi-Fi, well water, generator for power. The reviews were few and old. The most recent one was from 2 years ago. Some guy said it was basic but peaceful. That was fine by me. It was cheap too, maybe because it wasn't in a tourist area. I booked it for the first week of October, figuring the cooler air would keep the bugs down and the autumn leaves would make the place even better. The drive out was long but simple. I took the highway most of the way, then a series of narrower and narrower roads until it felt like I'd left the modern world entirely. By the time I turned onto the final gravel path, my phone signal was already dead. The cabin sat alone, maybe 50 feet from the water. No other houses in sight, just the creek winding along, dark and still under the gray sky. A line of pines stood like a wall on the far bank, and behind the cabin, the woods rose up into low hills. The key had been left under a rock by the front step, just like the owner told me in the email. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of cedar and something older, like a place that had been closed up too long. The single main room had a small couch, a coffee table, and a little wood stove in the corner. The kitchen was just a counter with a sink, a propane stove, and a fridge that hummed faintly off the generator. The bedroom was barely big enough for the bed and a dresser. Everything felt old but solid. No decorations besides a couple of faded photographs on the wall. Black and white shots of the creek in winter, ice covering the edges. I unpacked slowly, making coffee on the little stove and listening to the nothing outside. It wasn't the kind of quiet that was total silence. There were small sounds, the water lapping against the dock, the occasional rustle in the trees, but compared to the city, it felt like being dropped in another world. That first day passed easy. I walked along the shore, read on the porch, cooked pasta for dinner. The sun went down quick, and the darkness that came with it was heavy. Out here, there were no streetlights, no glow from other houses. Just black. The generator made a soft background noise, but when I turned it off before bed, the silence became a thing I could feel pressing against me. I slept lightly, waking a few times to small sounds I couldn't place. A thump, a creak, something faint against the wall. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe a branch shifting in the wind. The second day, I explored more. There was a path behind the cabin, just wide enough to walk single file, winding into the woods. The air was damp, smelling of leaves and earth. A mile in, I found an old fire pit with a couple of rotting logs around it. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. Beyond that, the trail just kept going, but I turned back before losing my bearings. By the time I got back, the sky was darker than it should have been for mid-afternoon. Heavy clouds were rolling in from the west, and the wind off the water had a bite to it. I brought in more firewood from the small shed and got the stove going early. That night, the sounds came again. This time, I stayed awake long enough to listen. It was faint but deliberate, something brushing along the outside wall, starting at one corner and moving toward the front. Then it stopped. I stayed in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, telling myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a deer passing close by. But it didn't move away. I could hear the smallest scrape, like something dragging lightly against the siding. After a few minutes, it was gone. Morning made it feel stupid to worry. I stepped outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was damp from light rain overnight, but I couldn't see any tracks. A few pine needles were stuck to the lower boards of the cabin, maybe from wind. I told myself that was all it was. The third day, I woke to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, more like a dull knock from somewhere far away. I looked out the window and saw nothing. The air felt colder, my breath just visible inside. The sky was low and gray, the water darker. I decided to drive into town for some extra supplies. The cabin's pantry had the basics, but I wanted fresh stuff, fruit, maybe a better dinner than canned soup. The drive to the small general store took about half an hour. The place was nearly empty. I bought what I needed and headed back. Halfway down the gravel road to the cabin, I saw a shape off to the side. A deer, I thought at first, but as I slowed I saw it wasn't moving. It was just standing there between the trees, watching the road. Its coat was rough and patchy, its head tilted slightly. I kept driving, not wanting to stop. In the rearview mirror, it was still there, watching. That night, the brushing sound came again, this time from the back wall. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. The sound moved slowly along the wall toward the window, then stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe loud. After what felt like forever, there was a single soft tap against the glass. I stayed like that until the first light of morning. When I finally got the nerve to go outside, there was nothing. No tracks, no marks on the glass, nothing disturbed. The air smelled colder, sharper, like winter was edging closer. I told myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was paying attention to me. The fourth day, I kept inside most of the time. Read, made soup, watched the water through the window. The clouds stayed low, and the wind picked up in bursts, rattling the loose boards on the shed. When night came, I kept the generator on longer than usual, letting the small light fill the cabin. But eventually I had to turn it off. The sound came back, this time from the porch. Slow steps, not animal-like, too steady, too heavy. They stopped at the door, then nothing. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I'd leave a day early. I packed my things, loaded the car, and took one last look at the water. It was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced in the mirror. There was someone standing at the edge of the trees, tall, still, watching me leave.